Okay, ladies and gentlemen, may I wish you a very, very warm welcome to this special event, this side event on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly Week, a special forum focused on youth-led peacebuilding. I'm delighted that we have pretty much a full house and a lot of talent and experience represented amongst the individuals and organizations in this room. Thank you all for coming. And thank you especially for coming at relatively short notice. I think especially the speakers, but also our team and our friends at the Jordan Mission are fully aware that we only got confirmation of the date and the time and this room allocation exactly 2 weeks ago on the 7th of September. So it's been a mad scramble, and I'm very grateful for the quick responsiveness of everyone to be here at this moment in this room together. We all share an interest in engaging youth, in peacebuilding, in conflict transformation, in grassroots social change to address different issues of conflict and violence. And I think we're all doing it in slightly different ways, using different approaches. And so the focus of today is really to bring to the surface those different approaches and to share and exchange. So it's very much a collaborative effort, a conversation. We're going to structure it in the form of 3 panel sessions, but in addition to the panelists, we really want to engage all of you in the audience and to have your participation and allow time for your voice as well. So we'll go through the program strictly to time, and I need to be strict on myself as well. So the framing of this forum really begins, I think, with the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And on his very first day in office, he pledged to make 2017 a year for peace, saying, let us resolve to put peace first. And I think he has consistently been repeating that message. Just a few days ago, in front of the General Assembly, he said, we need to be a world at peace. We're currently a world in pieces. And I think there is a sense of urgency felt by all stakeholders, government, public sector, private sector, NGOs, and civil society, that there is more work to be done, and it needs to be done with that sense of urgency. So I think that's what we all bring to the room, a shared interest and a shared interest in getting on with grassroots peacebuilding. Why the focus on youth? I think one key fact that resonates for all of us is that there are more than 600 million young people living in fragile and conflict-affected contexts today. They're among the most affected by the interlinked issues of violence, from political violence, criminal gangs, organized crime, terrorist attacks, violence extremism. And as youth, they're bearing enormous and long-lasting human, social, and economic costs. When we think of youth-led peacebuilding, I think in our sessions today, we will bring to the surface quite a vast array of different approaches or different interpretations as to what youth-led activity means, ranging from youth-led organizations to youth-led actions or just engagement with youth in activities on the ground. This morning, there was a ministerial meeting co-chaired by the Foreign Minister of Jordan and the Foreign Minister of Norway, really refreshing the commitment at that high level to UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. And so having had that high-level ministerial meeting this morning, I think we can frame our time together this afternoon as really thinking about what the words of that resolution mean in practice, on the ground, at the grassroots, in communities. And all of us are translating those words of the resolution into action in different ways. And that's what we want to share and exchange today. But in engaging youth and thinking about youth-led peacebuilding, I would ask ourselves the question of really how do we position our own work? Are we focused just on engaging youth with information? Are we engaging them through consultation in the design of programs and perhaps even policies? Are we really thinking of youth as being influencers in communities and offering them opportunities to exert their influence and demonstrate their leadership? Are we perhaps even going a step further and operating in partnership with youth, working with them rather than for them or doing activities to them? And lastly, are we really focused on empowerment in the sense of giving youth opportunities and then stepping out of the way to unlock the creativity and the innovation that they can bring? So a range of different approaches. I'm sure we'll hear examples of each one as we progress. I also just want to share a very useful website with lots of links and resources. Many of you, I'm sure, are already aware of it, but Youth-led-Peacebuilding.info is the home of the working group on youth and peace building. I'm delighted that we have two of the co-chairs of that working group, Cecile and Saji, presenting later today. On that website, there are some key documents, including a practice note, some guiding principles, and links, of course, to the resolution and lots of other resources. So if you want to read into the field of youth, peace and security, that's an excellent resource to start. And then beyond UN Security Council Resolution 2250, there are other parts of the UN system that resonate strongly with our work. Of course, Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, and amongst the array of goals, perhaps Goal 4 on education, Goal 5 on gender equality, Goal 10 on inequalities more broadly, Goal 16 on peace, and Goal 17 on partnerships. All of those are relevant. The others are also relevant, and we're seeing a lot of intersectionality in how we address issues at community level, but perhaps those are directly relevant to many of our activities. So I think this forum is really an attempt to surface diverse examples from around the world, different approaches, but all under that umbrella of UN Security Council Resolution 2250 and the Sustainable Development Goals. To set the scene, I want to indulge and give you some brief facts about Generations for Peace, the organization I represent. We are uniquely a Jordanian international NGO. So our headquarters is in Amman, in Jordan, but our work is global, operating in communities at the grassroots around the world. Over the last 10 years, we've been working in 50 countries. We've trained just under 10,000 volunteers. Their work engaging children and youth and adults in communities has reached a little under 400,000 target group beneficiaries. So I'd like to play a very short video that narrates our model and our approach, and maybe it will lead us into the other approaches that our panelists are going to present. If we could have the video, please.
Respond to it matters. For us, we all face conflict in our daily lives. How we respond to it matters. For ourselves, our children, and our communities. Those without skills to peacefully resolve conflicts can all too easily resort to violence, which can spread to social networks, neighborhoods, and even nations. At Generations for Peace, we strengthen people's capacity to respond to conflict without violence, break cycles of violence, and improve relationships through deeper understanding, tolerance, and trust. We believe in the enormous potential of youth to be change leaders. We empower volunteers to work in their own communities addressing local issues of conflict and violence. Using our unique curriculum, we train volunteers to analyze conflict issues in their community, design and facilitate programs with targeted participants, and measure their impact. Peacebuilding work takes time. We continue to mentor and support volunteers each step of the way. Volunteers we train then train more volunteers, passing on knowledge and skills. This cascading approach builds a growing pool of volunteers who can reach more and more children, youth, and adults with the skills they need to peacefully resolve conflicts without violence. We train volunteers to facilitate different activities according to community needs. Sport activities bring children and youth together from different ethnic groups, breaking stereotypes and building new relationships, reducing violence. Sport activities can also help to empower girls. Art activities with children help them overcome trauma and violence they have witnessed. Role-play activities with youth and adults surface issues of violence, engaging audience members to commit to change. Advocacy activities help gain the support of key community leaders to demand changes for peace. Empowerment activities include vocational skills training, providing an escape for those trapped in violence, such as male youth pressured to join gangs, women vulnerable to exploitation, or minority groups marginalized in their communities. Dialogue activities with youth and adults support improved communications, understanding of other perspectives, and less polarized relationships between opposing groups. We assess impact and sustainability of our activities, exchange best practices, and expand successful programs to more communities facing violence around the world. You can help us train more volunteers, reach more communities, and work to build lasting peace. Please donate, partner, volunteer, or simply share our story. Generations for Peace. Pass it on.
Thank you. So that's the sales pitch over for Generations for Peace. What I want to draw from our limited experience over just 10 years is captured in a booklet that's also available electronically on our website. And it describes our 10-year journey as a journey from passion to impact. And I think that's reflecting the passion we have as an organization and our organizational development, but really it's tapping into the passion I think you're all familiar with, the passion of people in communities on the ground and supporting them, usually with some structure, some technical know-how, not just financial resources, so that they can convert their passion into concrete, measurable impact. And I think a few lessons learned along that journey have been around when engaging youth, it cannot be only about trainings and workshops and seminars. It must have some connection with programmatic follow-up so that the learning involved is enabling youth to have the opportunity actually to apply that learning to demonstrate their leadership and their contribution to changes in a community. So it must be action-oriented. And I think that involves a long-term commitment to the youth, to the individuals who are trained, and to support them with ongoing mentoring and support through their program design, implementation, and evaluation. We find time and again that it is the first experience youth have had of feeling trusted to demonstrate what they can do. And I think that trust in youth comes with working with them, not for them or to them. So let's open up the conversation then with at first a musical interlude. Arts for Peace, as you saw on the video, is one of the tools that Generations for Peace uses to engage youth. And arts of different forms, whether it's visual arts, music, art, dance, drama, role play, interactive theater, poetry recitals, any form of artistic expression can be used to surface issues in a community and to begin a dialogue with the audience on issues of violence that they want to have a go at changing. So it gives me an enormous pleasure to introduce Ms. Farah Siraj, who I need to introduce you fully, Farah. Stay seated just for a moment. Farah was named Jordan's musical ambassadress. She's a virtuoso singer. She balances a career that spans the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. She's performed in some of the world's most prestigious platforms, including the United Nations, the Nobel Prize Hall, the World Economic Forum, the John F. Kennedy Center, the Lincoln Center, MTV, Coca-Cola Studio, and others. She combines her musical career with a deep passion for humanitarian action. And I think this is evident also in her music, the way her music is a fusion. It is embracing diversity across cultures, and the way her music speaks to issues of concern all around the world. During her tour of India, for example, Farah shared the stage with India's most renowned composer, A.R. Rahman, and the song hit #1 in the music charts in India and #3 in the Middle East. So we're in the presence of a virtuoso, a master, but more than that, a humanitarian, and a reminder for us all, in the very limited constraints of what is possible for us to do artistically in this room, of the power of art for peace. So it's a great pleasure, Farah, to introduce you and to give you the floor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you, Clark, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Iman and Generations for Peace, for having me perform here today for you. I'll start with the song I wrote about, for women refugees living in violence. And the song is called Lan Nansaki. It's in Arabic, and the lyrics say, "We've not forgotten you, we've not forgotten your suffering or your pain, and we've not forgotten your rights or your children's rights." في عيونك قوة، في عيونك صبر، في عيونك إيمان، في عيونك إنسانية، وفي قلبك حزن وتمني للسلام، في عيونك جمال لا يقارن إلا بالجمال، فافتخري لن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننسى جرحك، لن ننسى تعبك، لن ننسى حزنك وصبرك وحقك وحق أولادك. في هوا بلادك ذكريات، ذكريات أيام حلوة، وفي صوت الهوى رجع من البكاء والشوق لأيام الحرية، ولن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننسى جرحك، لن ننسى تعبك، لن ننسى حزنك وصبرك وحقك وحق أولادك، لن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننساكي، لن ننسى جرحك، لن ننسى تعبك، لن ننسى حزنك وصبرك وحقك وحق Thank you. Thank you so much. Shukran. So usually I perform with a guitar and with a band, but today this is one of the times where I'll be performing a cappella. So imagine that there's a guitar here accompanying me. This is not my usual setting, but I also will sing for you another song that I wrote particularly with the concept of peace and anti-violence and anti-war in mind. And the lyrics are on the pamphlet on the first page, as were the lyrics of the last song, but they're translated in English, so you could read them another time. And this song I wrote from the perspective, thinking about the perspective of a person who is observing war but unaffected by it, and how easy it is to forget that millions of people around the world are suffering and living in war and violence. And when we are so removed from the situation, it's easy for it to be so far away and feel so far away. But the concept of the song is to flip the table and say, what if one day I would see you could have been me? Then we wouldn't be so far, and then I wouldn't stand for this war. I can look the other way, but you may not survive today. There's 1,000 miles between us anyway. I'm too far to hear you pray. But what if one day I would see you could have been me? Then we wouldn't be so far. Then I wouldn't stand for this war. What if one day they came for me? Or even worse, for my family? Then we wouldn't be so far. And then I wouldn't stand for this war. But I'm safe and sound. I'm home at night, warm and dry, away from the fight. It's hard to imagine this could have been me. It's hard to imagine losing everything, everything. But what if one day I would see you could have been me? Then we wouldn't be so far. Then I wouldn't stand for this war. What if one day they came for me? Or even worse, for my family? Then we wouldn't be so far. And then I wouldn't stand for this war. And what if one day they came for me? Or even worse, for my family? Then we wouldn't be so far. Then I wouldn't stand for this war. Then I wouldn't stand for this war. Thank you. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Farah. That was incredible, especially to do it a cappella. We're really, really grateful. Thank you. We're going to move now straight into the meat of the forum with session one, giving voices of NGOs airtime, different lessons from the field, and a really expert panel assembled to showcase different approaches in different contexts. And the sorts of questions we're trying to deal with in this session are really what is being done by different NGOs in different places in regards to youth-led peacebuilding, what's working well, what lessons are emerging about how to engage youth effectively, how to access youth who are directly involved in violence or who are the most vulnerable to violence, how to attract and retain youth volunteers and youth leaders, how to train youth-led organizations and support their capacity development. What are the limitations of youth-led actions in communities? And what recommendations do we have from local experiences that we want to share across the field? So I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists. They're down this side. We're going to begin with Mike Jobbins, Director of Global Affairs from Search for Common Ground, sharing, I think, the many diverse experiences that Search has had over many decades in many different contexts. The floor is yours, Mike. Thank you.
a lot, Mark, and thanks to the Kingdom of Jordan for pulling this group together and for sustaining the attention on the youth, peace, and security agenda. It's an opportunity to really move beyond the notion that youth inclusion on these matters is nice, and moving into a recognition that it's truly necessary to engage youth in a different way if we're going to make progress on any one of the Sustainable Development Goals. For those who don't know, Search for Common Ground is one of the world's largest peace-building organizations in the world. We work in about 50 countries here in North America and in Europe, as well as in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Each year, we have about 200,000 children and young people participate in search programs. We work with about 1,200 partners. And through that, there's a number of things I'd like to say to Mark's question and to contribute to this debate. But I wanted to really just focus on 3 key lessons that we've taken through our years of experience working with children and youth, and as we look particularly to the role that youth can play in a changing world. So in terms of what's special about youth-led peacebuilding, I think the first observation is fundamentally, we live in a world that's outrageously unjust. Young people are the last to accept injustice, and nowhere is life more unjust than for children growing up in Congo, in South Sudan, in Yemen, in the slums of San Salvador or Jakarta. And it's only the only way that we'll see an end to some of the chronic fragility is by engaging those young people in a different way. But the challenge that we've seen with Search is that if you are a young person growing up in, let's say, South Sudan or Congo, I remember I served for a number of years in Congo, and one of the phrases that people kept saying when I talked to young people, that one of the problems in the conflict was what they called anti-values. And I never really quite understood what anti-values meant, anti-valeur in French. And it was only with time I realized that for a young person in Congo, it's like watching a Western movie, but where the bad guy always wins. It's the person who's the quickest to steal, the quickest to betray, the quickest to use violence, that's the one who rides off into the sunset. And the people who are trying to do the right thing, to stand up for peace, to help their neighbors, to help their family, are the ones who are the chumps in the end. And so a lot of our work with Search is focused on how do we create and support positive role models. So for example, we started a reality TV show. We worked with a popular R&B singer, a young man, a young production crew, to create a challenge among young people who wanted to make a difference, pitting a young man from one neighborhood against a young woman from the other to see who can get their water turned on first through a letter campaign to the government, how they could work with police to decrease street crime, and create, with maybe 10 million viewers across the country, create those kind of models, create those opportunities for activism, because fundamentally young people growing up in a system of injustice where life is fundamentally unfair will take action to address that. But how they do that depends on what are the options presented to them and what are the role models that they see. And this is of critical importance to the UN and to some of the other grand debates happening here today. For example, in Tanganyika district in Congo, there's been clashes that have displaced 500,000 people. There's about to be a cholera epidemic, if you believe the latest health reports. It's a humanitarian emergency and a protracted one that's cost billions of dollars for the humanitarian community over the last 20 years. And frankly, some of our best hope relies on a group of young pygmies and a group of young Bantu who've come together on both sides of the ethnic lines in that province of Congo to begin mobilizing their communities, setting up peace committees that link both communities and stabilizing that region so people don't have to flee, and so that those who fled can come home sooner. And it's that kind of hope and that kind of generational change that we need to encourage. Young people have the frustration, they have the will, they have the capacity, but by helping shine some light on the good guys and helping demonstrate some of these other pathways, we're in one of our best chances to really set things on a different way of overcoming what's fundamentally a generational crisis. The second example, the second lesson that we've learned is that young people are more connected than ever, and you'll see people talk about sort of Facebook numbers and Twitter numbers, and that's something that's very real and acknowledged by all of us in the general sort of public. What I think is less acknowledged is with the explosion of connection and connectivity there hasn't necessarily been an explosion of connection in the empathetic sense of the word. People are in contact more and more with people who are different from them, or aware that there are people who have fundamentally different views from one another, but they're no better necessarily equipped to engage with them. So we've launched a program about 10 years ago that's still running called Solia, where we're working on about 30 university campuses across the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, the United States, and Asia, running virtual exchanges, giving an opportunity for young people, ordinary people in their 20s, in the university environment, to discuss, to get to know one another, and begin understanding some of the sort of differences, but the humanity that unites us all. And we've partnered with MIT, we've partnered with Penn University here in the US. It's one of the most rigorously evaluated educational exchange interventions. We found that after the Boston bombing, we were working at the MIT campus, and as many know, a security guard was unfortunately killed in the events that followed the Boston Marathon bombings several years ago. We ran a randomized control trial of students who had participated and not had the opportunity to participate in that program. And what we found is among the general population, a spike, unfortunately, in anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment in the Boston area as those events played out over the news. But among students who had participated in the program, not only did we not see that spike, because people understood that Arabs, were a complex group with many different identities within that. They understood Islam was a diverse religion made up of 1 billion+ individuals. And that nuance was something that they had an opportunity to experience firsthand, and began equipping them to not necessarily react to some of the bombardment of negative press and news. And perhaps the last example that I'd like to show, to highlight, is something that we're very proud to announce today, and Saji, my colleague who will be joining us later, can talk more about it. Is fundamentally the way that young people see the change they want to make in their society, and the way that governments and donors and rich people budget for change in societies is fundamentally two different things. So search young people typically see the problems as holistic. It's not about an education intervention, a crime prevention intervention, a job creation intervention, a microcredit, this and that, each thing in its own silo. But rather, how do I build a better life for myself? How do we build a better life for our community? So we're partnering with governments, we're partnering with the private sector in Colombo, in Colombo, Sri Lanka, in Jos, Nigeria, to see how do we, rather than have people with wealth figure out the programs for young people, how do we actually transfer resources into a collaborative group of young people to take a more holistic view and build the kind of futures that they want to see in their cities. So it's a collaborative for peace and prosperity. It's something that Search is very proud to incubate, but something that we hope will be a new model for transitioning and translating resources into the hands of the people who ultimately will be the users and the builders of these cities and the world of the future. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you very much. I think already we're seeing some themes that I'm sure will be shared by others, but the emphasis by Search on promoting positive role models, I think that's incredibly important in engaging youth, and we're going to hear more of that, I'm sure, but the creative use of media to do that. Also, your description of the Solia program and virtual exchanges and engaging with universities to push innovation and to leverage new technologies. I think that's definitely a frontier we all want to push forward on. And lastly, just raising that idea about the challenge of how do we structure effective partnerships to deliver resources in a more collaborative way, rather than just giving grants. Let's put youth at the center of those structures and the management of those sorts of resources. So what an excellent start, Mike. Thank you very much. We're going to keep going through the panel, and then we're going to open it up to more conversations and Q&A with the audience. But next, I'd like to introduce Karen Scriven, who's the Senior Director for Strategic Partnerships at Mercy Corps. And Mercy Corps, of course, covering a huge array of development and peacebuilding activities, but a lot in the area of youth engagement and youth peacebuilding. So the floor is yours, Karen. Thank you.
Everyone for being here today on International Peace Day. And for those who don't know Mercy Corps very well, we are a leading global organization that believes that a better world is possible. We're in over 40 countries, and we're putting bold solutions into action by working together with people in their communities to triumph over adversity and to really build stronger communities from within. I'll just start off with saying that, probably stating the obvious for everyone in this room, that there's never before been such a large generation of young people out there in the world. And we often hear that youth are tomorrow's leaders, but youth are today's leaders. And so that is something that Mercy Corps is taking very seriously, as I'm sure all of us around the room take seriously. We really, similar to Mike, we see youth as agents of change who can really catalyze their communities and help them to cope with during crisis, to adapt during adverse times, to foster stability, and to really push forward development in their communities. And that is really our agency's call to action. I guess what I'll talk about today is really how Mercy Corps approaches our work. We take a systems approach to everything that we do, and that's particularly relevant in our conversation today because we take that same systems approach when we're working with youth in areas that are fragile in order to prevent conflict, to manage and resolve conflict, and to reduce participation in conflict. And we think that taking this system approach enables us to understand the conflict dynamics in societies and understanding that a conflict usually occurs because of a disruption in either the governance, the economic, the ecological, or the social systems. And it's a disruption in one system that can then affect and create conflict in another system. So everything is connected. This systems approach also enables us to really focus on the who and looking at each segment of young people, for example, young men, young women, girls, and boys, and really seeing how they are contributing to conflict, how their involvement in each system and each section of the system, whether it's ecological or governance and so on, and how that impacts their individual segments and how it impacts them differently. We know we can't change the whole system at once. None of us can. We all have to work in partnership. So we do a system analysis to figure out where in that system we can make the most impact and where we can really reduce or prevent conflict. And then we design holistic programming to really look at the drivers of those conflicts. So I'll just share 3 examples of some of the programs in which we are working with youth to address some of these various system drivers. So in Somalia, we are fostering stability and addressing social and governance grievances by helping to improve access to quality secondary education and facilitating meaningful youth-led civic engagement opportunities. I won't go into all the details of the program, but just to say some of the things that we learned. We had a study that was put out last winter, I believe, and it's called Critical Choices, and it's on our website. And it really did challenge some of the assumptions that we had made about programming for youth in conflict environments. And what we found was that improving access to education, it reduced youth participation in political violence by 14%, but it also increased support for political violence by 13%. But when you combined the improved access to education with meaningful civic engagement, where youth were leading community campaigns, where youth were having a voice in the shaping of the new youth policies that were coming out from the Ministry of Youth, that's when we saw a dramatic reduction in both support and engagement in political violence. And so we learned a lot that it really does take a holistic package of looking at what are those drivers that are impacting youth and how can we address those. In the Karamoja region of Uganda, 78% of the population is under 30. That's a massive generation of young people. And I don't think many of us had really thought about how to intentionally engage them. It was more of a build it and they will come approach. And so we really buckled down with our partner, PACT, to figure out how to stop the widespread violence that was happening. We were working with reformed warriors, and these are young warriors who, for years, had crossed over borders into Kenya and South Sudan and in their own communities and raided and incited violence. And then there was a disarmament in 2013. They went back over the border into South Sudan and continued the raids and the violence. They were finally convinced to come home a few years later from the government of Uganda and turn in their guns. But the challenge was they had no idea how to sustain a living without those guns. And they certainly weren't being welcomed back by their communities. And so they were very challenged on how to do this successfully and how to feel valued, how to feel respected, how to contribute meaningfully, and how to have a livelihood without using a gun. So we're working with these reformed warriors, and again taking that systems approach and looking at how to provide trauma healing, working on the social system, and training cadres of people, local organizations, to provide that trauma healing to the reformed warriors. We're also providing livelihoods training and access to village savings and loans, and then doing a lot of natural resource management, conflict management, and negotiations. So I just say the trauma healing, what we learned is that's just so critical for that foundation of social belonging, and really feeling like you have a path forward, and you can see that path forward. But clearly it's not enough. And we were dealing with multiple different communities in Uganda and across the border into Kenya, and found that there was one community that didn't have as much access to the livelihoods component as the other communities. And certainly the results of their ability to stay on a productive and peaceful path, the results were much weaker in those communities. So again, learning that we need to take that holistic approach with young people and meet them where they are. They don't live in silos. They don't live in thinking about sectors. They don't look at which organization is going to help them get what. They are living their lives. Let's see. I guess the last program I'd like to just mention is, in fact, in Jordan. And in that, we're taking just a completely different approach. We're focused on adolescence, and really believing that it is that time of adolescence where your brain is still developing at a very rapid pace. It's the most creative time for a person in their lives, and it's when they are influenced the most by those around them and the actions of those around them. So we are working to reduce youth vulnerability to recruitment into violent and radical groups. And we're doing this by really understanding the key triggers that make them and put them at risk. And we are looking at those grievances that would push them towards joining radical groups. We are again, we're taking a sort of a neuroscience approach to this and looking at the stressors that unfortunately impact your brain when you are filled with stress, and that hormone, cortisol, is impeding your ability to function as optimally as it could. We're looking at, I guess it's a form of psychosocial and trauma healing, coupled with working very closely with parents and their communities on making sure that they have the support system and the network in place. It's also coupled with youth-led community action campaigns, again, to let them be able to experience that learning and those different coping mechanisms that they're gaining through the psychosocial and trauma healing, and being able to apply them in their communities. So I'll just end in saying that what's next for Mercy Corps? We have, our teams rely so much on being able to evolve their programs and constantly using feedback loops to evolve their programs based on the feedback that they're getting from young people and based on the evidence that we are gathering. So I would say evidence is going to be a strong thing that we'll continue to focus on. We do have hot off the press Mali research that we hope folks will read. It's called We Hope, We Fight, and it really helps give another understanding of the pathway that youth take to joining armed groups and what is preventing some youth from joining armed groups. And finally, I'll just end with, from the perspective of Mercy Corps and our work, I think while we have had a lot of successes in working with young people, I think our biggest challenge is doing exactly what you talked about, Mike, which is consistently putting youth in the lead. We could take a much more consistent, positive youth development approach to our work. Youth are ready for it. Young people deserve it. And we need to set them up for success, and success means that they don't need us anymore. So we're committed to figuring that out.
Karen, thank you very much, and thank you for beginning with the reminder that youth are the present, they're not the future, and we need to be engaging them with that sense of urgency too. I think from the different case studies you've mentioned, what's interesting is that systems thinking, and really using systems analysis to understand more deeply the array of factors, push and pull factors, different economic, social, cultural factors that youth are navigating within their communities and navigating as they go through adolescence and youth in different stages of life. And you also, I think, alluded to the importance of gendered analysis in that systems thinking. And using that systems thinking, that really rich analysis to develop holistic programs that are truly responsive to the needs of youth, understanding that there is great intersection of different needs. And just to flag up the last thing you mentioned about indicators and evidence, I was particularly struck by the idea of, using pre and post measurement of cortisol levels of stress as a very interesting proxy indicator for development and post-trauma and efficacy and perhaps autonomy, self-confidence of youth. So very interesting, innovative work by Mercy Corps. Thank you, Karen. Our next speaker is Saba Ismail, who comes from Pakistan and is the founder of a very interesting NGO based there called Aware Girls, but also is double-hatted today as a representative of the Peace Direct network, who are supporting a range of interesting NGOs all around the world. Saba, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the picture from the...
Yes.
Yep. Okay, it's working. It's okay. I'll start. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So as Mark said, yes, I come from the northwest of Pakistan, and an area which is severely affected by the violent religious extremism and extremist groups like Taliban and like Al-Qaeda, and unfortunately, which is ranked number 4 in the Global Terrorism Index Report 2016. But first, going into my presentation, let me just share a very personal story. When I was 15, I moved to my college hostel for my studies, and in the first month when I went to the hostel, I was asked whether I was a Sunni or a Shia. Those words were very new for me at that time. I never heard of that. So I said, I don't know. I was asked to describe the way my parents taught me to pray and the way my family pray. When I described, I was told that I was a Sunni. Well, as you may know, that Pakistan is a Sunni Muslim country, it's a majority Sunni Muslim country, so I was on a very safe side. But the girl Sanya, who was living just right opposite to my room, and who some assumed to be either a Shia or an Ahmadi, who are another sects, and they are targeted. So Sanya was hated due to her religious identity. And at that time, at that moment, I learned that identities are very strong. They're very deeply rooted in our society, but also along with the deeply rooted violent religious extremism in the country. While at home, I was never taught to either love or either hate anyone on the basis of their religious identities. But this experience that I gained inside of an educational institute, it really was a beginning in my life, a new beginning. What I did with this new learning was that I decided to disrupt those ideologies. And I started challenging the extremist groups and the extremist narratives. And that's how it was the process that at the age of 15, I and my sister Gulale Ismail, which actually established Aware Girls. And it's a young women-led organization working for women empowerment, for gender equality, to promote peace and also to counter and prevent violent extremism in Pakistan. And it is also the only organization from Pakistan and among the very few civil society organizations who, along with a lot of support from other institutions, advocated for the Security Council Resolution 2250. So one message that I really want to give today through my talk is that young people are playing a role in peace building. Not everyone that comes from the conflict-affected country, like Pakistan, has a violent thinking and a violent approach. They are making a difference through their work and through their actions. They are really doing something. So to challenge the extremist narrative and to dissuade young people from joining the militant groups, we established Youth Peace Network, which aims to counter and prevent violent extremism. Youth Peace Network is a unique network working to build peace and harmony by engaging young people as peace activists, by empowering them, and also by creating an environment where they can engage in the civic and political processes, by imparting them the skills of nonviolent conflict resolution, tolerance and pluralism, and also enabling them to promote alternative narratives of nonviolence. So what we are doing through the Youth Peace Network is that we are using very diverse strategies and different strategies. Like one of them is peer-to-peer education, in which once young people get trained, they actually work with other young people, and they actually prevent them from getting recruited by the militant groups. But other than the peer-to-peer education, they're also what we have done is that we have created digital stories, small digital stories. The members of Youth Peace Network has written blogs. They have worked through media. They have also organized different peace campaigns. They have organized sports events. They have organized study circles. They have organized workshops and also walks to promote peace. They have used many different strategies, as I explained. In one of them, for example, the study circles are small group of people sit together and they talk about these issues for at least 3 to 4 months. And it is a very close interaction. They identify other young people who may be vulnerable to be recruited by the militant groups. And they also actually talk to them about the kindness that is there in the religion, and not only the very selective information that is given to the young people intentionally. They have the other members of Youth Peace Network have also organized different rickshaw campaigns. So they have printed different messages of peace, and they have pasted them on rickshaws, which are the local transportation system in many parts of Pakistan. What we are also doing is that we are reconstructing the bonds in the community, and we are strengthening the social fabric harmed by the extremist groups by bringing people of different cultures, different faiths, and also different ethnicities together through intercultural and interfaith dialogues through which they understand each other. But we also, what we do is that we organize exchange visits and exchange programs to different religious places, like churches, like Hindu temples, like Sikh gurdwaras, like mosques. And through these visits, we break these stereotypes that is created by the society and through media and through our education system. We connect also communities through music, through art, and also poetry for peace. We have developed partnership with the literary societies, and we organized these kind of programs in which there is poetry, in which young people do also write poetry. They share their poetry for peace, and they collectively built a narrative of tolerance and pluralism, which actually ultimately takes away oxygen from the extremist narratives and groups in Pakistan. So there was one Christian girl, her name is Jacqueline, and her father was killed by a Muslim, and she really had this hate towards Muslim, and she decided, as a kid, she decided that she will never be a friend with any Muslim because she had this hatred because her father was killed. It was very hard for us to convince her to be part of Youth Peace Network. But once she joined the Youth Peace Network and once she was engaged through these interfaith dialogues, she was completely transformed. And she realized that it was mere an individual act, a revenge that a person took from her father, and it was not because of their religious identities. We have also reclaimed spaces from the militant groups like Taliban, especially in Swat Valley. There was a hotel which was once the headquarters of Taliban, where they would slaughter people and they will hang them in the blood choke, which is actually the blood choke. The original name of the blood choke is green choke, but because the Taliban would slaughter people, it was like well known as blood choke. What we did with this hotel was that we transformed that hotel into a peace institute. And the picture that you see actually on the back, on the screen, is from that hotel, in which we organized a peace vigil. In this very specific room, there may be people, maybe in hundreds and thousands of people, who were slaughtered during Taliban regime. And it's very hard for me, so like this place, some floors were not even renovated. They were still painted with blood. There were people's blood on some floors. But we used that space for peace programs. And we organized vigils, we organized a series of peace programs. We have organized all these programs in this hotel, just to remember the people who have lost their lives because of violent extremism, to remember them. To remember them in the work of peace that we are doing. And that's why I just thought that I should just share this picture with all of you, just this one picture. Well, the Youth Peace Network that we started that in 2009 only with 30 people, but now we have more than 600 and plus young people, and we are reaching, these 600 plus young people are reaching to more than 3,000 young people annually. The Youth Peace Network and all these activities are designed by the young people themselves. So we design all these programs together in consultation with young people. Also, through the Youth Peace Network, we have already started implementing the 2250 resolution, and we are advocating for youth peace policy. We have organized a series of consultations already, and we have also organized a series of policy dialogues to have a youth peace policy in Pakistan. And for this youth peace policy and the implementation of Resolution 2250, we are very thankful to UNAOC. Just Vanessa, before the event started, she just handed me over this copy that you can see. Well, again, this copy is also a very, very important for me when I just saw this before this event started, because this picture is, again, it's just that it's only a few days ago when I left Pakistan, because, well, there are many friends in this room that know that I can't go back to my country, but the thing is that I have this memory, and this is something that's really important for me. So thank you, Vanessa, for sharing this with me and making my day. Well, we are also fighting the extremists by empowering women and girls. As research has shown that gender-equal societies are more resilient. We governance structures are one of the factors that give more spaces to the militant groups to recruit and also to have to infiltrate their own agenda. So we are strengthening these governance structures through effective participation of young women. What we did was that when we organized these political leadership programs for young women, in 2013 local elections, 10 women from the rural and very remote areas won local elections. 10 women win local elections. It was a huge history because for the first time in those communities and villages, it was for the first time ever in the history that a woman was running for the election in those communities. And as research and statistics have also showed that when women are included in peacekeeping processes, there is a 35% increase that the agreement will last more than 15 years. And we are very thankful to Peace Direct for inviting me today to speak with all of you, but also for their continued support for more than 8-9 years for our work and for believing in us, for having the local first approach. So we are really thankful to them. What we have also done is we have building bridges between women peace builders from Pakistan and Afghanistan through establishing a network providing opportunities to women peace builders from both countries to have a common platform where they are sharing their experiences, but they are also strategizing together to counter and prevent violent extremism. In the name of counterterrorism and security initiatives, well, millions of dollars have actually been invested in more weapons, more guns, and more bombs. Every penny spent on a gun, on a missile, on a bomb is injustice to every kid who wants to go to school but cannot pay for it. It is injustice to every kid who is hungry and is not fed. It is injustice to every girl who is denied for her rights. And it is injustice to every young person who wants to do something for the society but is either stereotyped as a troublemaker or as an extremist. So let's divert this investment and let's invest in peace. Let's invest in young peace builders. I'll just share, just 10
Sabra,
seconds.
10 seconds.
Yeah, 10 seconds. I'll just share a quote by Bacha Khan, who is also known as the Frontier Gandhi, that it is not enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it. And it is not enough to believe in it. One must work at it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sabra. I think Sabra's example is a really personal story. And Sabra, I want to thank you for sharing your story and really for illuminating what courage it takes to work in that context as a 15-year-old young lady when you started to develop a women-led organization and to engage youth in that way. I also think the use of arts creatively, including poetry recitals, is interesting for us. Youth have that talent, that creativity, and using it also to deal with the past. And I think that's an important part of peace building. We cannot move forward unless we have really come to terms with the past. And often arts are a really good tool for addressing the past. Thank you, Saba, for sharing. Our next panelist comes from a very different context, working on very different youth-related violence issues. I'm delighted to welcome Kariana Thomas, who comes from the New York Department of Health, but works with a program called Cure Violence in urban areas in the city. Kariana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm truly humbled to be here celebrating the International Day of Peace with you all today. My name is Kaliana Thomas, and I'm the Coordinator of Technical Assistance and Community Engagement for the New York City Cure Violence Programs under the Center for Health Equity with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. The CV model was created over 15 years ago by Gary Slutkin, an epidemiologist with the University of Illinois at Chicago. Based on the understanding that violence is a learned behavior and can be spread, the CV model is a public health approach that aims to treat violence as a contagious disease by interrupting transmission, preventing future spread, and changing community norms around violence. The model is situated in neighborhoods with the highest incidence of violence. Since its inception, the CV model has touched 25 cities in the US and sites internationally, including Iraq, Syria, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Honduras, Brazil, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Panama, just to name a few. The model works to target high-risk youth who are most likely to be perpetrators and/or victims of violence. This is all done through the use of credible messengers. The elders of every community use their lived experience to mentor their youth towards positive paths. Our credible messengers are exceptional in that they were leaders in their community based on their negative decisions. Whether it be gang-related or dealing with illegal activities, at one point in their life, they were the role models that led the youth that we work with on the path that they are now. But since these people have come back to these communities and have used their experience to now work with youth to take them on a positive path. Credible messengers are respected, streetwise, and connected, and able to relate to youth. Based on their knowledge of community dynamics and their similar lived experience, they're able to identify and reach the highest risk youth, those likely to perpetrate or be victims of gun violence. Over time, they are able to change their participants' attitudes and acceptance of violent behaviors, and these youth become ambassadors of peace for their communities and help to spread this message. The model was brought to New York City in 2010 with 5 sites. Today, the model has expanded to include 18 sites in all 5 boroughs. These 18 communities once accounted for 50% of the overall gun violence in New York City. The New York City Department of Health, in collaboration with multiple city partners, including the mayor's office, support cure violence programs by providing technical assistance aimed at model fidelity. Here in New York, we have also adapted the model to include enhancements such as work readiness support, legal services, school conflict mediation, therapeutic services, employment opportunities, and hospital-based interventions. Under the Center for Health Equity, we are now aiming to expand the public health support of the model by sharing the root causes of violence and helping the communities we serve to understand the concepts of structural violence and racism. By doing this, we aim to arm these communities we serve with information to help them become advocates for themselves, therefore turning every community member into an ambassador for peace. Thank you.
Kaliana, thank you. I think it's an amazing innovation to approach violence from an epidemiology lens, a public health issue lens. But it is proven to be effective from its early days, incubated in Chicago, to contexts now all around the world. What a great model, and a lot of lessons for us about how you can use different disciplines to draw upon ideas when you're really thinking about systems change and holistic approaches. So if you haven't heard of them before, check out Cure Violence and see the great work they're doing online. Thank you, Kaliana. Our last panelist for this session is Mr. Raul Caceres, who's Chief Program and Technology Officer at Peace First, who are doing extraordinary work at the intersection of technology and communities of practice that are really youth involved in peace building around the world. Raul, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So Peace First was founded 25 years ago by a group of young people in Boston, and they really wanted to use peacemaking as a way to change the world. So over the past 25 years, we've been really trying to understand better how we can help young people turn ideas on how to solve injustices into real projects, real peacemaking projects. And as Mark said before, there are over 600,000 young people that are experiencing violence in different ways around the world. And unfortunately, we usually see young people as either victims, as problems, or as the future, but we rarely see them as powerful or as part of the solution. There was a study done at the Berkeley Media Studies that looked at all of the stories from young people here in the US over a period of 18 months, and they found that only 1% of those stories were positive stories representing young people in positive ways. So that's something that we really wanted to start looking into. And over those 25 years, we have had a number of different programs. But I want to tell you a little bit more today about one of our more recent programs called the Peace First Challenge. And it started really about an idea of how can we create a movement powered by young people that can counteract the current narrative of violence and division, not only here in the US, but also in other parts of the world. And we started by researching movements around the world, and we found that a lot of those movements had 3 things in common. They had young people that were leading those movements. They also had stories, powerful stories that inspire others. And then they had simple invitations for others to then join that movement and to create that critical mass. So we started designing that program using those different elements. And so the Peace First Challenge it's a global call to young people that want to identify an injustice in their community, and that they want to use a peacemaking lens to turn those ideas into real projects. So we have like a very simple framework where they identify an injustice, they spend time trying to understand that injustice a little bit better, they create a plan, we give them a mini grant, and then they take action, and then they reflect on the work that they've done and reflect on how they've changed internally as individuals as well as at their communities because of the work that they've done. And we provide them with a few different things. So we provide them with tools, with resources. We also provide them with digital mentorship and face-to-face mentorship if needed. And more importantly, we provide them with the opportunity to connect with other young people that are doing similar work around the world. So we have an online platform that we use for that purpose. And basically, we run a number of different campaigns focused on different issues, depending on people that are interested to invest in this kind of approach. So we start by finding the young people, meeting them where they are through both kind of digital channels and through partners, through traditional media. We then help them run their projects, so turning their ideas into real projects. We then invest on the ideas that have the most potential, and we put more dollars and more resources behind them. And then very importantly, we tell stories. So we have a simple framework where we try to make sure that we identify the stories, we package them in different ways, and then we distribute them in the different channels where young people are so that they can feel inspired by those stories as well. But if I was to kind of summarize kind of our theory of change, I will say that we just go to where young people are and we ask them, how can we help? So we don't spend any time trying to tell them what they need to do or how they need to do it, but we just go there with lots of tools and resources and ask them, how can we help you? And we help them in whatever way they tell us. We can help them the best. And so we've done that already for about 18 months. We've done already these with a few hundred projects, and we started trying to really understand what was working the most. A few very surprising things. Firstly, we were asking young people, what did you find was the most powerful thing that you think we did to help you turn your idea into a project? We thought maybe they were going to talk about the curriculum or about the money or about the face-to-face events. They told us the most powerful thing was having a group of adults that finally believed in what we could do. So they really trusted us to do the work that we wanted to do. And we found that very, very surprising. And so that's what we've been continue trying to do. To actually today, before this event, I was launching the new version of our platform, where we are trying to really use all of the lessons that we learned over the past year or so, and begin to expand and begin to get to more young people all over the world. And I want to leave you with a reflection. So over the past decade or so, I've been going to many communities all over the world, and especially in post-conflict areas, and kind of trying to talk to the community leaders to see if we can do these kind of approaches that are youth-led for young people to really start thinking about how they can be the leaders and solve the problems in their communities. And most of the time we find that the adults in the community they really do not believe as much in the power of young people. So we have to actually ask them to just give us a couple of weeks. Let us spend a couple of weeks with your young people, and we show you what they can do in just a couple of weeks, so that you can really see the potential. And time after time, we keep surprising the community leaders when they really see, oh my God, this is what the young people in our community can do. And that's what can really start changing those perceptions that adults have in the young people that are part of their communities. So over the next year, we're hoping to invest about $1 million directly in the ideas of young people, not only here in the US, but all over the world. And I want to really invite you to, when you go back to your communities, to your projects, to your programs, to really believe on what young people can do, to stop telling them what to do or asking them, explaining to them or giving them the frameworks that are already defined, but really go there and ask them, how can we help? And then just help them in whatever way they can be helped the best to turn those ideas into real projects. Thank you.
Raul, thank you very much for sharing what I think is a very interesting example, because it's perhaps at the end of the spectrum that is really open and taking a much more aggressive approach to risk. Really being responsive to youth and simply approaching them with the question, how can we help you, rather than lots of pre-designed structure. So very interesting. Also, I think very smart in the way you're going about using technology and the way you're set up as a learning organization. And I think wonderful to get that feedback that one of the most important things of all for youth to feel is to feel trusted by adults. And your whole organization and your model is set up to be oriented that way. And I think that's an important message maybe for all of us that we need to carry also to stakeholders outside this room. to governments and to other stakeholders in our communities at different levels, that the most powerful thing we can do is to stop seeing youth as the problem and to instrumentalize them, but actually to open ourselves to the huge potential if we get out of the way and let youth use their creativity to make changes in their own community. So wonderful example, Raoul. That brings an end to the panelists of the first session. We have about 9 or 10 minutes. So I want to open it up immediately to the audience for questions and answers. You can please, when you're making a question, use the microphone, identify yourself, your name and your organization if you represent one, and your question can be directed to any of our panelists individually, or it might just be an open question and we'll try and field them as we go. I'll maybe take 3 or 4 questions and we'll see if we have time for any others. So who'd like to pitch the first question? Hands up. Yes, one question here and then over here. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nalini Chugani. I'm with Education Development Center. I manage a lot of youth development programs, largely focused on workforce development. And civic engagement is largely becoming a lot of the work that we do, and it's increasingly becoming important for us as we work in fragile and insecure environments. So the question that I wanted to ask is about civic engagement interventions. I want to know a little bit more about what kind of specific civic engagement interventions some of you are working on in your programs.
Thank you, and we'll take the second question and maybe a third or fourth, and then we'll respond. Thank you. Just hold the button down, yeah, until it goes, yeah.
So hi. Oops.
It's good.
I'm Rosalie.
It's good.
My name is Rosalie Vasquez-Yetter. I'm the Global Director for Civil Society at Partners Global. And I think I'm directing this at everybody that just spoke. It's a general question. The new models that you're talking about, some that are not new but that we don't hear of as much, I'm curious to know, a lot of what we're looking at is also what are the trends that we need to be considering, and then how are the funding trends either following or responding to these different approaches that we all believe we need to take when we're working with youth and letting the youth lead. So kind of what are your business models, and are you looking at changing the way you're sort of seeking revenue and other resources?
Thank you for those questions. Perhaps a third or fourth over here. Yep.
Mark, it's more thoughts than questions. Is that okay? Okay, so I have very quick thoughts to share. I'm going to make them very quick. So, and I'm speaking from my experience. I manage a nonprofit organization that works for youth empowerment. It started in Jordan. It's called NGOs and is now running in 15 Arab countries. We've also noticed that access to education can be access to extremism and violence in some local communities, because lots of teachers come with their own agendas, and a kid who, like yourself, at home was not exposed to that kind of thinking is usually, or happens to, get familiar with that type of thinking from school. So access to education is not necessarily, a positive thing from that perspective. A second thought is sometimes I feel that we also participate in the perception of Islam being linked to extremism and terrorism, and because we use the same language that we don't like to hear from the media. I'm talking, of course, as a Muslim. I do not, I'm not comfortable with the media using Islam when describing a person who happens to be a Muslim doing something bad, but not using a different religion. If that person has a different religion, he or she is not described with their religion. So we kind of use the same thing. We kind of use the same language. ISIS chose to name themselves Islamic State. We give them that pleasure. We also call them as Islamic State. I personally think we should not do that. We should refer to them as Daesh, because this will be in history books tomorrow. And we are participating in linking this description to Islam. A third thought is, from our own experience, economic empowerment is key. is very important for prevention, for youth in specific, and for reducing extremism. And my fourth and last is I think there should be more players in the social sector trying to influence or working on prevention, not by working with youth on the ground. Of course, that's very important, but mostly working from pressuring or influencing political leaders. That is prevention. I think dealing with young people from war zones is like dealing with really symptoms more than prevention. Reducing pain in many cases. The real prevention is to try to prevent the use of hard power. And I think we need more organizations that work on the real prevention of terrorism, because I'm a big believer that war is the main source of terrorism and extremism. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dima, for those contributions. I think we should come back to the panel for some responses, but I'm going to manage two of them immediately, because the question about trends in funding, I think we're going to cover more adequately in session 3. So I think, Rosie, hold that thought, and we'll get back to you on fundraising and trends in sources of funding for the field. Also, Dima, one of your points about the linking in the media of Islam with extremism and also leading to Islamophobia. I think we're going to cover that in the very next session on violent extremism. So with that, we have the following topics left for our panelists and anyone to volunteer for responses on civic engagement interventions. Any example that somebody would like to share on that? Mike, have a go.
Sure. I think just quickly, and happy to talk more offline, I think one of the key challenges we've seen in a lot of civic education or civic engagement programs directed at young people, particularly in conflict-affected areas, recognizing that the sense of grievance and injustice can sometimes drive activism and drive change into violence. There's a tendency from a lot of civic engagement actors, civic education actors, to sort of use a message that, be quiet, everything is fine, a pacification, an implicit pacification within so-called civic education programs that in a lot of ways are both inauthentic and unethical and backfire. And we see this even in well-meaning electoral engagement kinds of programs. What we find is much more effective are civic engagement programs that give an opportunity to raise a voice. So at Search, we run call-in shows, for example, across South Sudan, across Congo, and elsewhere. Even the simple act, for example, when we look at demobilization programs, there's so many strategies developed in conference rooms like this one that treat sort of young combatants and armed groups as sort of monsters that live in the forest and come visit the townsfolk, and it's just a sort of a theoretical exercise. But actually, in the Central African Republic, sending out a young journalist with a microphone to talk to his peers, what do you think about the negotiating position that's being discussed up there, has such a powerful impact in giving voice, particularly to those directly participating even in violence or potentially participating in violence. So rather than sort of messaging, that opportunity of giving voice is something that we found particularly effective.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. I think the next one was perhaps around access to education. Might not be the silver bullets it's set up to be. It may also present certain risks in certain contexts. Sabo, you want to have a go at that one? Yeah.
It's just a quick response. Is that I disagree with this statement that access to education can open to violent extremism. I think it should be like this, that access to selective education opens to violent extremism, because the selective education that is given to someone actually leads those young people, or kids from a very young age, they are brainwashed, or they are given this very selective and one-sided information. Because on the other side, there are people who, if they are not able to get properly educated, they become even more prone to be recruited by the militant groups. They are even become more prone to be promoting the agenda of the violent extremist groups. So that's just one thing that I really want to mention. That's it.
Superb. Thank you, Saba. The next one was economic empowerment. I'm wondering if Karen has an example from Mercy Corps' experience. I'm guessing you do, Karen.
So let me just make sure I understand the question. What are we doing around youth-led
Yeah,
economic empowerment?
I think it was probably alluding to the fact that we may be engaging youth on a range of issues, but the economic pathways into employment is clearly a key piece of the puzzle.
Sure, and I'll just say that we have another growing body of evidence around the importance of integrated solutions. So we certainly have challenged the common assumption that a job will lead to peace, and it doesn't if you aren't addressing those grievances that surround that. So, but we definitely do know and have seen from our Karamoja programming that without that addition of livelihoods and vocational training and access to opportunities, it's really hard to sustain that long-lasting change.
Thank you, and I think we may come back to that topic when we look at violent extremism as well. I think the last one is the bigger question is, as we all seek to work more upstream, how or should we be engaging in trying to get reductions in the use of hard power? Is that part of our mandate or not? Does anyone have a view on the panel about that you'd like to share? Yeah, Mike.
I mean, I would say fundamentally, if our general thesis is that injustice drives a lot of the violence, frustration, and recruitment by armed groups, then addressing that injustice is the sine qua non for making any progress. I mean, there's only so much you can do with youth, at the grassroots level without also amplifying that and without recognizing that there are global systems and structures that need to change to fit the modern world. At the same time, I think no one is better positioned to lead that change than young people themselves. And so much less do I see it sort of about us sort of being myself, I suppose, or Search or the international groups, advocating on behalf of young people, but rather creating opportunities for people from places affected, for example, affected by conflict, in shaping how global institutions, shaping how global policymakers see their countries. And I think Farah, in her song, sort of touched that as an opening touch point, that ultimately, until we sort of can empathize and reflect those of us who aren't affected by conflict and empathize with those who are, it's very difficult for us to, I think that's the point where we can really start making a change.
Yeah. And just to add from Generations Peace experience, I think at that level, it's really about policy advocacy to governments and political leaders. Some organizations in the room are well positioned to do that and have skills and capabilities and networks. Others operating at grassroots level don't have the capacity, but might try to partner with organizations that do. And in Sri Lanka, for example, Generations Peace is operating at grassroots level on people-to-people reconciliation, but partnering with the National Peace Council, who are far better experts than we are on national policy advocacy and driving greater awareness of the national government-led processes on truth and justice, truth and reconciliation, so that people on the ground are more receptive and ready to participate in those processes. So you don't have to be the expert at all the pieces of the puzzle if you can partner with other organizations that fill the unmet need. So I'd please like to ask all the audience to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for session one, Mike, Karen, thank you all very much. You've set a high standard for the forum. I'm going to hand over to my friend and colleague beside me, Dr. Mohamed Al-Arabiat, who's president and board member of Generations for Peace, to introduce the second session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I was going to introduce myself as Mohamed, but you did that. But let me add a point. I try to look at my appointment as president as an empowerment of youth, even though I'm 35. So let's look at this as a good decision and an example of a Jordanian NGO actually empowering youth to drive strategy and actually set a path for where organizations should work and what should do. I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm extremely privileged to be talking to such a distinguished audience. And I feel this is an opportunity for us and for our messages to reach key stakeholders who will influence decisions at some point. Let me first introduce. So I'm going to play a kind of a weird role. I'm going to be a panelist and at the same time moderator, so I'm going to moderate myself at some point. So we have first Mazen Hayek, who's from MBC Group. He's the spokesman for the group. MBC Group is the largest media conglomerate in the Middle East. They've been doing great work in the area of countering hate speech and countering violent extremism. Mazen has joined MBC Group in 2006 and has presented in different forums on the role of media in countering fear and extremism and promoting hope and positive role models. Mazen also serves on various boards, including the International Institute of Tolerance. Welcome, Mazen Hayek. And then we have Charles Rogan, who's a senior advisor and policy fellow at the Artists International. Charles is a Middle East specialist, and his research focuses on unconventional power, political Islam, violent extremism, and the politics of the Gulf region. Interesting combination. His work supports research of the Center of the Resolution of Intractable Conflict, CRIC, at Oxford University, and he frequently briefs governments and multilateral audiences on this work. So I'm going to try to frame the discussion, and I'm going to basically present 4 points, then leave the field for our guests. From our perspectives as peace builders and people who work in the peace building field, there seems to be two different kind of feelings toward the word CVE. Some people feel that this kind of trend is an agenda in a way that distracts us from the real roots and causes of conflicts. In a way, it makes us overlook the macro level factors that lead to conflict. While other people see that there is a lot of overlap between what we do and the outcomes that CVE efforts try to achieve. So that's the first point. The second point, that many peace builders, based on that, try to describe their program in a way to fit people who are now funding CVE. And let me point to something that we have been noticing in Jordan recently, the creation of almost a CVE market, where there is money and there is competition for research on doing CVE. And we've reached almost a point of saturation where the results are saying the same, but money is being pumped in that market, and it's within kind of a closed circle of certain NGOs, certain research centers that keep working on the same things. So that's something to think about. Another point is that the lack of clarity and kind of the rift in definitions between what some call CVE and what some call PVE. For us at GFP, we look at CVE as more connected with counterterrorism, as more security related, and that countering something that already exists. From a PVE perspective, which is kind of the approach we would like to adopt, it's looking at resilience, it's looking at communities, and it's looking at kind of achieving impact at communities, which would help us prevent youth from becoming vulnerable to radicalization and joining extremist group. Another point which is very important, and which was mentioned also, is the relationship between CVE kind of language that we use and its relation to hate and Islamophobia, and how that language could actually kind of make the problem worse while we're trying to kind of label things, but at the same time, as Dima mentioned, we're making the issue worse by using those labels. For myself, I'm going to discuss the Jordan context, which I've had experience in working on, specifically in CVE from a communications perspective. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Charles in a way to set up the frame or the field from a research perspective and to tell us what the research has been telling us and how this research can inform our decisions as NGOs, as funders, as governments, as multiple stakeholders working in this field. So Charles, to you.
Well, thank you, first of all, to the UN, the Kingdom of Jordan, and Generations for Peace for having us all here today. I think you introduced it well with the discussion about CVE versus PVE. It's quite a contentious debate at the moment, and it's sort of flowed from the CT narrative. I would completely agree that CVE is more security orientated, it's more reactive, whereas PVE is focused on preventative measures. Let me first start by briefly discussing the current environment we face in terms of trying to counter violent extremism and prevent. On the one hand, ISIL today is conventionally in its last days. However, as the head of CT at the EU mentioned last week, there are estimated to be 1,500 former ISIS fighters currently in Europe. We shouldn't be deceived or have any pretenses that more attacks are not going to come. I am confident that more attacks will come. What this is going to do is going to destroy what ISIS calls the grey zone. People are going to be attracted towards ISIS because you're going to have, as we've seen over the last 2 years, the rise of nationalist movements across Europe and across the United States. This is going to create a negative spiral effect, which is ultimately really going to hurt societies all over the world, and we're going to have increased fragmentation, which is going to lead to more migration movements, and ultimately it's our job here today, and it's a very important job to try and understand how youth are affected by this and how we can engage youth. I would like to say that it is concerning that we still focus on these socioeconomic factors for radicalization. The research actually shows that less than 1% of people who are what we call susceptible populations, those who are from a low socioeconomic status, those who are ideologically predisposed to environments such as political Islam in Saudi Arabia, for example, or those who are unemployed or have a low level of education are the ones who become violent. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, you're 17 times more likely to become radicalized if you have a PhD in engineering. And these sort of statistics are very important. It's not necessarily that giving people jobs or economic incentives or hope is a negative, quite to the contrary. However, you need to give people purpose. This is not a new sort of theory. We can go back to the 1950s with Eric Hoffer and Julian Rotter discussing a locus of control. A job needs to have some kind of tangible incentive to the person, and that's where the work that my colleagues and I do, focusing on sacred values, really comes to the fore. We believe that values which cannot be negotiated with material incentives and trade-offs are the most important to society. People will do much greater things for the positive and the negative if they hold sacred values. It's trying to identify these values in youth which can be harnessed, which can draw power out, which can bring people together to lead really, truly remarkable changes to which Sabah, for example, has led in Pakistan, and I'm sure many of you are working on great things around the world. We need to harness this, but we need to understand that communities need to be targeted in separate individual ways. Each independent community has its different values, and macro policies, which target something like education, are far too broad to have any real focused effect on targeting those specific individuals. 3/4 of individuals joining radical Islamist groups today come from networks of friends. It's not this, this current, it's a myth in reality that the recruiter will find someone on Twitter and that's how everyone is being recruited. It's networks of friends. So how can people in the UK, in Spain, where we were working earlier this year in March, we were looking at Pakistani migrant populations in Barcelona, and lo and behold, a month ago, we saw the horrific attacks. How can we find an avenue for these people to be emboldened and go forwards? And lastly, I'd like to add on a note of free speech. I think it's truly damaging if we try to tell people that they can't use terms like Islam, political Islamism, Salafi jihadism, because ultimately those people who actually don't understand what these concepts mean will be emboldened. I'd much rather debate someone on the merits of political Islam, of Sharia, who doesn't understand it, than tell them they can't speak, because you're ultimately going to drive it underground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Charles, for the insightful thoughts and kind of giving us some data and information that would for sure help us, at least from our perspective and Generations for Peace and looking at Jordan, the case of Jordan. We always try to kind of base our programs on what we call and what everybody calls target audience analysis, and looking specifically at local contexts, because we actually know that this specific area, it could be even a village. At that level, this is the kind of work that should be done at the micro level. Thank you very much. Now, this is the weird part where I'll moderate myself. Now I'm gonna be doing my speech, and as Farah was doing her performance, I kind of questioned my decision to tell this story because I got a bit emotional when she was singing. So I'm gonna start by telling a story which affected me personally. 2 years ago, I met an incredible Jordanian woman. Her name is Rula. She served at the Jordanian Army in the Royal Medical Services. She was a nurse. In 2005, she tells me, on November 11th, which we call in Jordan our 9/11, because we have the calendar done backwards, she went to a wedding party along with her little niece. She told me weddings for Jordanian women is an opportunity to look beautiful, to look best, to look at their best. She went there happy to celebrate. The hotel she went to was one of the 3 targets that were hit by terrorists on that day. Jordan hasn't seen such an attack for quite some time. To many of us Jordanians, terrorism was something that happened elsewhere. It doesn't happen to us. So that's the kind of belief that every Jordanian had. Rula's little niece left us on that day. She remembers her lying next to her as if she is asleep. Rula lost her consciousness after part of the roof fell on her. Many thought that Rula was one of the casualties on that day. She told me that because of the explosion, her handbag landed next to another body of a female victim. It was assumed then that this was the body of Rula. Her family was contacted and informed that Rula was one of the victims. Many of the bodies were unidentifiable. The family began preparations for the funeral. Later that night, the family got a call that this was a case of mistaken identity and that their daughter is alive but is in critical condition. Rula survived and still has shrapnel in her spine and her skull. She got treatment in Jordan and abroad. She went to King's College in London and got a master's degree in rehabilitation of spinal cord injuries and came back to Jordan to teach. She is now a major in the Jordanian Army, Royal Medical Services, teaching future nurses. She says that terrorists destroy and I rebuild. When she was telling me her story, I teared up, and I still feel shaken when I tell her story. She didn't. She showed power and, more importantly, resilience. I felt really small in her presence. She refuses to use the word victim, and she says, I'm a survivor. If I accept that I'm a victim, then they have won. To me, she became the Jordanian phoenix. She rose from the ashes, and her story is the story of Jordan, a story of survival, and she is one of the reasons that I'm here now. Unfortunately, I'm telling this story, not many people in Jordan or in the region know this story or stories of other heroes. I told this story to highlight the importance of storytelling and the narratives that we use in our fight against extremism, and the expression of that extremism in violent forms. And I need to highlight here a point. We always talk about violent extremism, and in many ways we forget the base, the extremism. To me, this story represents a narrative of resilience. We need such narratives, narrative of hope and narrative of peace. In their analysis of ISIS propaganda, Quilliam Foundation has identified 6 themed narratives: brutality, mercy, victimhood, war, belonging, and utopianism. Through narratives, extremist organizations have been effective in tapping into deep ingrained ideological values and in exploiting grievances as means for successfully engaging susceptible and vulnerable audiences. At the core of this, as Professor of Nationalism and Ethnicity John Bruley put it, is an imagined theme of restoration of a glorious past in a transformed future. Such narrative is very difficult to match unless there is a holistic approach and coordinated efforts at all levels. Increased volume of hate speech, which you mentioned, is in many ways related to increases in identity-based violence. We can see the relation even here in the US and everywhere in the world. When you look at social media and the increase in the amount of hate speech, you directly see an increase in hate-related violence and identity-based violence. So the relation is there and it's very obvious. Since 2007, I'm going to talk a bit about GFP. Since 2007, I'm sorry, let me go back to one thing and drawing parallel between hate speech and narratives. If we draw a parallel, then maybe we can identify and see that there is a link between narratives and violence. Extremist narratives in that sense might not be the only cause of violence, but they certainly provide rationalization, explanations, and motivations to violent extremist behavior and gives legitimacy to groups that promote extremist value. This is going back to the idea of extremism before the violent extremism, the idea of rationalizing violent behavior. Since 2007, we have worked with hundreds of thousands of children, youth and adults in 50 countries on 3 continents to address diverse local issues of violent destructive conflict. Applying the peace-building lens to the violent extremism, we have gained modest experience through testing and refining our core peace-building approach to extremism in general. So allow me please to share some of our experiences with you. The immediate assumption is often that unemployed youth are the most vulnerable to recruitment, which was mentioned before. And if given a job, the youth will have a stronger resilience. In our work, we have found that the principal drivers of violent extremism are not rooted in poverty, but in perceptions and experiences of injustice. Without any doubt, there is a complex landscape of push and pull factors in which youth must navigate, which comprise of mix of opportunism and ideology, economic, political, social, and cultural horizontal inequalities, and the search for safety, meaning, and belonging. Extremism may be a global phenomenon, but its driving force is local. This is going back to the same idea. It's a global phenomenon, but the solution has to be at the most local level. Second point, understanding communities as complex systems and looking at the complexities that exist within those systems. If we start looking at the issue of violent extremism within communities and understanding them as systems interacting with each other, then maybe we can have better solutions. Then, this is my passion, which is the idea of value of communication. And I have 2 sentences that, in a way, I heard recently, and they capture, in essence, what I would like to say. The first one is shout your success. Our stories need to be told. They need to be amplified as much as possible. We need to fill the gap in hope. We need to fill the media with stories of success. Many of us are doing great things on the ground, but not many people hear about this. There is a great gap there that needs to be filled. The second sentence, you cannot be what you cannot see. If we look at our girls, our boys, what do they see? Who are their heroes? So this is another thing that we have to focus on from a communications perspective. Hero narratives, role models that will inspire our youth to actually look for a better future. From that perspective, media plays an important role. And MBC, one of our partners, is playing an important role in countering and preventing violent extremism through programming that provides both counter and alternative narratives. So I will hand the mic now to my friend and colleague, Mazen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Muhannad. Very compelling story, very touching. I come from a region that for the last 69 years has been overwhelmingly witnessing bad news versus news. So the ratio of bad news versus news is 90 to 10. Since the eruption of the Arab-Israeli conflict to Daesh, we've developed an adaptation and a fatigue to bad news. So numbers of millions of refugees don't move people anymore. Pictures and footage of torn apart bodies or wreckage or people under the soil don't move people anymore. And this is hard to deal with from a communication and from an image perspective. Then what I heard today is extremely important on heroism. I mean, the difference between heroes and villains lies in the simple lack of integrity at the villains, though they project themselves as heroes. And we have so many of them in our lives, in politics, in terrorist networks. And our region is in need of positive role models and transformative leadership. If the youth that we do the casting for The Voice or The Voice Kids or Arab Idol or Arab's Got Talent or you name it, their dream is to become famous, then we have a major issue. If the value that they believe in for the future used to be, I want to become rich, now I want to become famous, then the research leads you to role models being entertainers or influencers or people known publicly, but whom I wouldn't trust necessarily with my kids and their future. So this followership, exposure, fame, culture is gaining grounds at the expense of serious transformative leadership and value-based leadership in our region. Hence the discontent, the brain drain, the violence, then you name it. So we have an issue in the value system. We have an issue in the absence of role models. We have an issue in the absence of transformative leaders. They will come up in specific countries. In Saudi Arabia, you'll hear of a name. In UAE, you hear of another name. But you won't have a consensus on a transformative or more transformative leaders in the region. Hence the need, as Muhannad said, to help create local heroes in the communities. Because terrorist networks are filling a vacuum in society. They're not coming from nowhere. They're filling vacuums and they're projecting their leaders as ethical, believers, non-corrupt, perfect saints in society. In the absence of others who would counter this, you're leaving them the ground to fill in share of mind and in effectiveness on the ground. So the youth of our region is very much connected, very much open, very much positive, but practically they're missing out on every single thing in life. They have no jobs. Youth unemployment is the highest in the Middle East. This is a region that has the biggest global conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, homegrown terrorism, fighting religions together, huge ideology issue. So we have it all in a region that has 350 million people, out of whom 180 million are under the age of 25 or 30. So we're sitting on a time bomb. If you think today we're witnessing the time bomb, wait 10 years to see the time bomb result where the Middle East will be. So if we don't deal with it today, what we're witnessing today is a dream compared to the nightmare in 10 years' time when the 10 years old becomes 18. And when I see someone recruited or a suicide bomber taking $50 or $100 to blow himself up, then we have a serious issue of development, of corruption, of wasted wealth, of non-redistribution of wealth, of lack of building the future. These guys are connected, but we're not participating in the ICT revolution. We're not making them participate in building the future and running state affairs and being effective in their societies. So they're sitting there waiting to become a singer or doing nothing till they become a singer. But then if they don't have talent shows to become singers, There was an article a couple of weeks ago in the Washington Post on the kids, on the children in Gaza, in Palestine. They have nothing to do. They live on antidepressant and on high pills, so that they fill their days by buying time till something happens. So no hope, no development, no future, no opportunity to. Then what do you lose if you take $50 or $100 and blow yourself up and you make headlines? Nothing. This is the mindset. This is what we're facing. So we need diplomacy, defense, development, technology, investing in knowledge economies. We need everything now before it's too late. And I hear us talking about peace. Yes, we're talking a lot about Daesh, but our issue started way before Daesh. We've been living the Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948. And this has resulted in huge injustice, huge feeling of oppression, huge. I've dealt with Palestinians, I've dealt with Arab idol Muhammad Asaf, who had practically at best 0 chances to become other than a singer in weddings. Now he was received here with us in the building by Ban Ki-moon. He's a global star. He's a goodwill ambassador to UNRWA. We created a life for him thanks to TV, but otherwise he would have still been sitting in Gaza. I witnessed the same last February with Yaqub Shaheen, who won Arab Idol, a young Christian from Bethlehem, winning on a Saudi network. That's big. I witnessed with the winner of The Voice, a veiled woman wearing her hijab, voted by 100 million viewers. There are stories among Arab youth, but they need more than just TV and more than just exposure platforms to shine and be known and be valued in society. This is what we're witnessing on a daily basis. We have what it takes to compete. We have what it takes to take them out of this despair, lack of hope, fear culture. But we need conflict prevention. We need transformative leadership. We need people who take us out of this building the future on the recipe of yesteryears. So how can I solve the Arab-Israeli conflict if I cannot talk about it? If I cannot sit with the Israelis and talk about it? Then how can I deal with my issues if I'm going to have to stick to what the Arab Spring had some hope and led to bloodshed or to the return of dictatorships? No one has recalibrated Arab Spring. No one in our region came and said, this is Arab Spring 2.0. Don't lose hope. No, your destiny is not in bloodshed, nor in authoritarian regimes. There is something else. No one is telling them this, other than the Cairo speech of President Obama, which led to nothing. There is no hope. There is no hope. So you wonder why 160 million have no hope and they wanna immigrate and they wanna go to the States and to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazen. I want just to bring us back to something, a statement I've heard somewhere in rationalizing the investment in NASA. And the statement was, it's an investment in the imagination of our kids. When you ask a kid, what do you want to be? I want to be an astronaut. So it's not only about those kind of tangible things. When we talk about the future and kids and generations, which is in our name, we need to invest in the imagination of our kids. Charles, a question. Do you see a divergence or convergence in research regarding CVE?
I think there's a divergence. I think one of the primary reasons for this is still the confusion between CVE and CT. I mean, CT to me seems almost like a operational tactic to go and advance on the enemy and essentially destroy them, whereas CVE is trying to it's more focused on security in the realm of intelligence. But more broadly, CVE has its challenges because, again, as we're talking about, these macro conditions are often used as the explanations for violence, but Things like nihilism, people say, well, if someone joins Daesh, they're nihilistic, they just want to go and kill themselves for no reason. Well, I would argue to the contrary. I would argue that people join a group like Daesh for something greater, for some revolution which is profound. It's similar to the French Revolution. We've seen these things. These are why values are so important. Let me give an example. Sacred values. The value in America in 1750, people in America, the British who were living there at the time, had the highest living standards out of anyone on the planet. And yet those people who were not armed, who were not supplied, decided to rise up against the most powerful empire on the planet. Why did they do that? It wasn't for some material gain, because these people already had the highest standards of living. It was because they believed in something. They had a true passion. So how can we ignite that passion in the youth? And one more thing I'd like to add, a good example of a program which worked, but it actually talks to the complications of bureaucracy. The USAID was funding a program in North Africa. They'd essentially given free rein to build a community center with some sports fields. They had free internet in there, and they let the children use the internet. They emboldened these children, which is critical. I think everyone here would agree that it's critical to embolden, and it's much easier to say than do. But these children were exploring, and they were going on pornographic websites. They were going on jihadist websites. And when my colleague Scott Atram went there and did the observational work, he said, "Wow, this is one of the best programs I've seen anywhere in the world, because these people are free. These children are free, and they're making their own ways. They're not being told what to do." And as we've heard repeatedly, you can't tell people what to do. But this gets back to State Department, or the US taxpayer cannot be funding young children going on pornographic websites and jihadist websites. So how do we reconcile these things? And it's a great challenge, and it's, in all honesty, it's an opportunity for NGOs to get involved, because I can promise you, State Department do not like that.
We're not going to give access to porn
If
website.
I may I want to build on what Charles just said. We've recently developed a fiction series called Black Crows. It's a series that we broadcasted during Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan, the month of fasting, that delves into the world of Daesh, focusing on the role of women in Daesh, because we chose this angle because it's the most vulnerable. It's through which kids are recruited, and the most of abuses are done against women and children. One of the reasons we knew we were taking a risk by producing it and airing it, and it was somehow like a secret project till we announced it 2 days before airing. We did it because enough is enough. We can't, as global networks, as regional networks, watch the propaganda and the communication of terrorist networks happen, and we just cover it in the news, or lament and show solidarity and say, pray for Istanbul, pray for Paris, pray for Manchester, pray for London. I think this is too reactive. We need together, communication-wise, to move to the proactive mode, not to the reactive mode, to the attack mode, not to the lamenting mode. Enough. I mean, if we, as big networks around the world, cannot join forces and produce 100 series a year that uncovers the ugly face of terrorism, then we failed our mission. If we can't in Europe and in the Middle East and in the US do like Narcos or like Black Crows, but 100 series in a year, we're failing our mission. We're leaving the ground for them to communicate and to win hearts and minds. So we did it, okay, death threats, you name it, we don't care, but we showed them that Arabs and Muslims are against what they're doing, and we can do it by Arabs and Muslims to an audience that accepted it and watched it and made it the #1 drama during Ramadan. So people are ready to say no to terrorism, but we need to do more of it, communication-wise and media-wise.
Thank you, Mazen. I just want to share also what we're trying to do at GFE from an experience sharing perspective. We're now focusing more on creating partnerships with media outlets. MBC is an example, and we're also creating partnerships with local media outlets, with news websites, with local television channels and radios. And the idea from our perspective, since we do not have much funds to fund actual production and content production, is a low-cost kind of model where our message can be amplified and hopefully will give us visibility which will make us more attractive to funders locally. So that's an example of what we're trying to do. We're also kind of utilizing social media and using social media influencers to reach more audiences. So this is kind of an experiment and a model we're trying to implement at GFP, and hopefully next year or in our next meeting, we'll update you on the results on what have we done. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience, please. Please go ahead.
My name is Carla Alvarez, and I was formerly directing a project in Mexico, Monterrey, Nuevo León, in the northern part of the country. I think the risks for young people in Latin America are a little bit different. The pull have been organized crime, and the models that have been available to discuss violence and crime prevention have fairly stemmed either towards gang membership prevention or religious extremism. And I think in Latin America, we're having this larger debate about how do you address organized crime? And the factors that pull the young people there that are very much on a short-term, high risk, but high rewards of power and financial assets. And something that we struggled with a lot in the field was trying to identify the metrics to actually allow us to figure out who are those young people at most risk and what are those risk factors. We use something that's called the Structural Assessment on Violence Risk in Youth. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. But what I'm seeing and I hear often is that we're all trying to approach and create models on youth positive engagement and social change through our own milieus. And I have not seen yet a larger discussion, maybe a more macro analysis of what are the risk factors that we need to be looking for. And for example, if you're talking, Charles, about values, what are the values that might make someone more susceptible to engage in violence or not? So I'd welcome, I don't know if it's up to you or have a larger discussion, but this is something that continues to stay at the top of my mind. And I think the metrics and the indicators is something that I really would like to hear more about.
Charles?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great point. We don't only focus on value structures in the Middle East. We are currently doing work in Chile at the moment, for example, looking at the value structure. So what, essentially our model is we send a team of field researchers, which are comprised of a variety of different people, but often we have to have behavioral psychologists as part of them, and that's how we essentially set up these survey instruments. And so we go and conduct these surveys with maybe 50 different issues, which are very important in the local community. And once we've conducted the surveys, we'll see what's really resonating with young people, whatever the population may be. It can be an age group, a demographic. And I can say that we've actually validated these metrics with fMRIs in Barcelona. So we've taken our field research from northern Iraq and looked at those surveys, and then we've taken it to people who identify and support Lashkar-e-Taiba in Barcelona, and our surveys, are proven to work because you cannot fake it when you're doing an fMRI on someone. So yeah, we absolutely do that. I can't tell you what the specifics will be in the context of Mexico, for example, but that's why it's important, really important, to drive field-based research. And for an organization such as ours, which focuses on security and development, we often implore governments, IGOs, to fund our work, because rather than sitting in an office in DC pontificating about the realities of the world, it's much better to actually get out there and do it. And trying to break down the, it's almost like a time-space compression, trying to get towards those people. That's why at the moment we're working outside of Mosul with populations who've most recently come out under the control of ISIS, because those are the people who have the sentiments and who've most recently been there. That's why it's really important to do the work that Generations for Peace is doing. Get to the field and try and do it and try and understand these values. And I hope that answers your question in some small way.
Thank you so much, Charles. Adrian?
We in the States struggle with semantics a lot. Countering extremism, violent extremism. Donald Trump has, switched those words around. He won't you know, we add Islamic extremism now at the government level. We don't acknowledge neo-Nazi groups, which are our own version of extremism. So what are the words that we should, in the media, should be using to describe your kind of programs, especially when it comes to, you know, when it comes to when you're countering groups like ISIS and so on? And that's one more question related to that. You know, from the media perspective, what sells is, especially if you're going for something like the New Yorker or the Atlantic or something like that, is someone embedding with you know, with youth being recruited. There was a big story in the New Yorker about Tunisia and the effect that ISIS had on young Tunisian men. I mean, how would the media go about, say, embedding with people who are, or with youths who are actually undergoing some of the, you know, radical reversal that you guys are doing? I mean, because that's a story there, but it's very hard to, I mean, that's a hard sell for editors. So maybe you have some suggestions on that.
Let me speak Jordan's perspective. I think the language question and the kind of words that we use is very important. And media plays an important role in actually either kind of building resilience, building diversity, or actually turning a crisis into something worse. And that, I think, needs capacity building, especially in a country like Jordan, where we see sensationalist media using images to provoke hate speech from people who follow them. It's basically a way to drive traffic to your website by being as provocative as possible. So the driver is not actually promoting something good. The driver is driving traffic to your website to get more money for the advertisement on your website. And I think there needs to be a capacity building and a legal framework to actually deal with this. Now, from a media and media engagement and being embedded, I don't think we have reached that degree of maturity from a journalistic perspective where we actually have journalists embedded in such circumstances or scenarios. For example, I follow Vice News. They do a lot of work being embedded, for example, with Iraqi forces in Mosul and Raqqa. They do a lot of work, and it kind of gives an image of what's being done on the ground from a security perspective. And whether we like it or not, people like to see something being done on the ground from a security perspective. So this, in a way, gives a sense the government is doing something, is actually doing something. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything. Okay, please go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I say this not on behalf of any organization, just in my own personal capacity and from my own personal studies. Let's not forget about the role of foreign intervention, and in particular foreign wars, that drive a lot of this sentiment for this. Let's not forget how they help destabilize regions and fuel conflicts and help extremists build into the narrative, who then exploit children, vulnerable children, who are affected and angry by what's been done to them. And it is this that is always overlooked in a lot of the conversations about radicalization and the role of young people within it. Let's not forget how those children become the victims of these things, and then that helps fuel this. And I just want to talk about this one quote or one poem which summarizes it perfectly by Auden. And he says, "I and the public know what all school children learn. To those whom evil is done, do evil in return."
Thank you so much. Very powerful. And I think going back to the first of my speech, I would call it a speech, we mentioned the idea within the CVE field that is it actually a distraction from the macro level variables that actually might lead to radicalization, and we see that in our region. For example, look at the case of Jordan. The Syria war and what happened in Syria has drove many Jordanians to join extremist organizations. So it's basically war that was a main driver for many Jordanians to join organizations like Daesh or Al-Qaeda, which is now Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham. Thank you.
Can I just?
Yes, absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that wars, foreign intervention are a huge driver of radicalization. At the same time, non-intervention is also a huge driver of radicalization and recruitment. If you look at the Syria context, establishing red lines essentially gave Assad power to exercise conventional military attacks, barrel bombings of his civilians, gassing his civilians, and essentially what you've had there is a binary effect, so that people are either forced to join ISIS or forced to join Assad. And we've got this war which is in perpetuity at the moment with no real solution in sight. Also in the case of Iraq, which is, I think you actually hear a lot about Iraq being a case, an explanation for chaos in the Middle East. 2003 was obviously, as I see it, a huge mistake. It wasn't remedied until 2007. I actually think from 2007 the renewed doctrine in Iraq really stabilized the country, and you saw a 76% decrease in violence. It literally was the next day that Maliki went on a real rampage against the Sunni Arabs in the Sunni Arab Triangle, and that really caused the destabilization once more. I think by 2011 Iraq was actually doing incredibly well, and I think people forget that a lot of the time. But I think you're absolutely right, drones is another great example of being, radicalization. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking my fellow panelists. I hand it back over to Mark for session 3.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to keep the momentum and the energy going. We're just slightly behind schedule, but I'm sure we can make up time. We've got another fabulous panel. I'm going to invite, Cecile and Saji just to come and take your seats. You've got your names on the electronic displays in front of your seat. So this last panel for the forum is all about future trends, and we've got very interesting diverse threads to try and weave together all the way up to 6 p.m. Trends around what is the future for the resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 2250, around how do we consider rebranding peace in order to better engage youth, around what are the opportunities for more effective media engagement and corporate social responsibility in support of youth-led peacebuilding, looking also at the intersection of climate change, conflict, and youth-led peacebuilding. And last but definitely not least, we're going to be looking at the future of funding for youth-led peacebuilding. So really diverse, really interesting, really important threads. Let's get straight into it. I'll invite Cecile Mazzacurati, who's head of the Secretariat for the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security at the United Nations Population Fund and Peacebuilding Support Office. That's quite a mouthful, Cecile. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. If you say it in acronyms, it's even better. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. It's very nice to be here today to discuss the future of 2250 and what's happening. Well, what's happening for the resolution. So, the first thing I'd like to say is that 2250 at this stage is just a toddler. Didn't even turn 2 yet, just got up on its feet. And I think we're just at the very beginning of something that hopefully will keep growing and blooming. And of course, because we're during the General Assembly here, I want to mention the meeting we had this morning organized by Jordan and Norway at ministerial level on reaffirming commitment on the youth, peace and security agenda. We had, it was the moment to launch a group of champions of youth. So 22 member states and the EU just came together to say that they want to be the champions of the 2250 agenda. I think that's a sign that the agenda is getting traction, it's getting understanding. We had very good statements by ministers and other high-level representatives from government. So I think slowly but surely, the understanding of young people's role and potential in relation to peace and security is starting to make its way. I think 6 months after the adoption of the resolution, we wouldn't have had the same discussion than what happened today. So I think we're really just at the very beginning. And if we look back at other resolutions, of course, I'm also thinking about 1325 on women, peace and security. We've spent a lot of time talking with the community around women, peace and security, and they all said it took years for the agenda to really take up and really find its traction. So I think we're just at the very beginning. And I want to say a couple of words about the progress study, because hopefully that is a very important milestone, but it's definitely not an end point. It's a starting point. The idea is really to help with that study what the youth peace and security field is. What is peace building by young people? What are its strengths? What are its challenges? What should member states do? What should the UN do? What should civil society actors do? And all this is, we're trying to do that, building and really taking everything from what young people themselves are saying. Because of course that's one of the fundamental principles of this agenda, is putting young people at the center. So if you were at the ministerial event this morning, you certainly heard Graham Simpson, who's sitting over there at the back of the room, who is the lead author, appointed by the SG, the Secretary General of the UN, to lead that study, which is supported by the UN and a number of partners, but will be an independent study. And the methodology that Graham defined for this study is, first and foremost, to listen to young people, which we're doing through different means, some classical UN ways, so to speak, such as regional consultations, but also focus group discussions in numerous countries, in partnerships with some partners here, including, of course, Search for Common Ground, to get the voices of young people who typically don't have access to the type of global policy-making discussions that we're facilitating here. Now, so all this to say, I think we're just at the beginning. But of course, there are many challenges, and I want to talk about 5. The first one, I think, will be to make sure we keep the wide diversity of partners in this agenda. The Youth, Peace and Security agenda was born from, I think, a pretty unique form of collaboration between young people and youth networks, civil society organizations, the United Nations, foundations, etc., and eventually member states. But it's this diversity from its very beginning, which I think gave it its strength and its power and possibly its success. And I think keeping this diversity of partners involved and working hand in hand is key, and something that, of course, can become more challenging when the agenda becomes more political, when there are member states and possibly competing interests that are coming into place. So that's one. Another one is to make sure we keep, as much as possible, the depth and the complexity of the agenda. It shouldn't evolve into simplistic rhetoric, which we can often see within these walls. So it shouldn't become, it's wonderful, young people are the future, or all young people are peace builders. And these type of, empty sentences about who young people are, etc., which are just very simplistic. So we just have to keep that understanding of young people as divided political actors. Some will be peace builders, some will be troublemakers. A lot of them will just go on with their lives. They will have, come from different backgrounds. Some will be young women, etc. I mean, it's very easy to just start talking about youth and their wonderful potential, etc. So trying to keep a much more refined discourse on young people will be key. The third one, of course, is to keep a very strong focus on the specific role of young women and on the gender dimension of these discussions. This is very central to what youth, peace and security is. It's very much about empowerment, and it's very much about empowerment of young women and recognizing their role. So I think that has also to remain. And two other really key challenges is to make sure we keep supporting and implementing good projects and good programs. So now if I switch hat for a second, my office, the Peacebuilding office, manages the Peacebuilding Fund. And the Peacebuilding Fund opened up 2 funding windows for projects supporting youth, peace, and security. And so what we've seen is, you know, and the second window is still ongoing. So some great projects, but also a lot of old recipes that we think we already know are not working, but nevertheless keeps being proposed. So the problem for peace building in country X is that young people don't have access to jobs. So we're going to give a 3-month short-term undignified job opportunity, and we will have built peace. And other of the same kind. Or this project is going to support young people in the Central African Republic. Great. Where exactly, who, how, etc., etc. So we see in terms of programming, and interestingly, because these funding windows are open to UN and to NGOs, we've seen that the NGO projects are much stronger than the UN ones. So I think there's also, and that's also an illustration of something we've seen in this field from the beginning, which is innovation is coming from civil society and is pushing the UN to do better. And the last point is, of course, funding. Making sure we get the funding support we need for this agenda overall, and for support to youth-led organizations in particular. And we know it's extremely challenging. There was a survey done in the framework of the study by the United Network of Young Peace Builders and Search for Common Ground, showing that most of the youth-led organizations operate with very, very small amount of funding. We know that donors are not equipped to fund small youth organizations. Again, we saw it from our side, from the Peacebuilding Fund. When we first opened up to NGOs, we thought that's great, we're going to fund all these really grassroots youth-led organizations. Not one met some of our administrative requirements. A minimum budget, monitoring, external audits, reports, etc., etc. So we're not equipped to do that. So we have to build into our mechanisms as funders a way to support these youth organizations, because that's the only way they will get the support they need. Thank you.
Cecile, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Graham Simpson for joining our forum, and I think he's just left, but he was taking a lot of notes throughout the session, so great that he's been involved and showing interest. Cecile, thank you for showing the challenges, and I think some of those challenges also present opportunities for us to consider. So opportunities, you mentioned the range of diverse stakeholders and how important and valuable that is. We can extend that also to the private sector and to the media, and I think we'll have a thread on that in a moment, but also encouraging NGOs to apply. Sometimes there are opportunities out there and we're not taking them up. So we need to be monitoring and engaging and, if necessary, partnering on proposals, and especially the last point you made about supporting grassroots organizations, maybe mid-size NGOs, collaborating with them on joint proposals and including capacity development as part of the action. I think we need to see more of that sort of collaboration in the field. Thank you, Cecile. Our next panelist is Julia Roig, who is double-hatted. She's president of Partners Global, but also here representing the Alliance for Peacebuilding that's doing very interesting work, trying to join up stakeholders in the field across the USA and internationally. Julia, you have the floor. Thank you.
I don't think we have enough time, so maybe we could just put the slides up, Mark. Would that be okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially under the invitation of Jordan. So, you know, I was really pleased to hear as much talk today about the word narratives. How are we going to change the narrative? We have to understand the narrative. You know, we've got to be louder. We've got to shout. We need to have these partnerships to break through the noise. And so on behalf of the Alliance for Peacebuilding and Partners Global, I wanted to share with you a new platform that we've been investing in for about 8 months now. which is really trying to address this concept of narratives for peace, but really through a partnership approach. So really thinking about narratives as an ecosystem. We are an ecosystem here. We, in fact, are probably an echo chamber of talking to ourselves. And we have extensive networks of wonderful young people all over the world, but we still are a drop in the bucket of the narrative landscape, the media landscape, and these other influences. I really took to heart the point of there's things that are happening on the ground, values being activated every day. And at the same time, we know that today's youth are marinating in narratives online, through the media that they consume, the music they listen to. And so how do we up our game as a field? And when I say a field, I mean the UN, I mean the peacebuilding community. So that's the intention of the Narratives for Peace platform. So if we could go to the next slide. You know, really what we're doing right now is trying to create an overarching platform so that our peace builders, our allies, citizens can really convene under a brand to say that peace is something that's attainable. We talked a lot about hope, that we can achieve it if we're doing it together, and we think that really we need to be building new partnerships. We talk a lot about business for peace. We may talk a lot about workforce development, you know, some of the ways we think maybe what youth really need. But, you know, youth are influencers. We know they are influencers also in this kind of media space. And the video I wanted to show you, if some of you have seen, is this generic millennial ad. I wonder if some of you, it's a very tongue-in-cheek. It was a little bit provocative. But, you know, when we talk about the youth bulge, as maybe being problematic, it's also an asset. And there are, there are brands, there are companies that are the business model of big media, that absolutely are advertisers. They want to get to those young people, and they're trying to figure out, what do you want? What are you talking about? What do you want to buy? How are we going to influence you? And we need to be influencing them. So we've got 4 pillars. We've talked a lot about rebranding peace. There's a lot of... I'm excited for the dramatic music in the background helping me discuss the power of narratives. But there's several organizations within our field that are really talking about this concept of branding. But more than that, we want to talk about also this collective storytelling engine. You know, how inspiring to hear Saba's story, but also the fact that her Youth Peace Network is generating content. How do we get that content to a broader audience? I'm really impressed with our colleagues from Cure Violence as well. They have a fantastic documentary, The Interrupters. How do we get that content out? We need to do that through having sophisticated networks in big player media, advertisers, creative industry executives. So finally, we're trying to amplify these voices and drive ultimately collective action. Thanks for continuing. One of the challenges that we have, and the beauty of our field, is how diverse and complex peace really is. We know that. We love that, actually. We over-complexify all the time because it's, you know, it's local and it's this aspect, and we're good about bringing in a lot of diverse perspectives in the work we do. This is really bad messaging. Are we no war, anti-violence, youth empowerment, women first, you know, no nukes? Our movement and our allies are dispersed. So how can we possibly break through the noise? Because the people on the other side are very targeted. They are very focused. And until we get our act together, I'll say that a couple more times probably, to say we need to start playing at the grown-up table, decomplexify a little bit, and at least have a frame, a uniting narrative frame that we can use the power of all of our collective voices for the kind of change we want to see. We can go ahead. Sorry, you're going to have to do it twice. Okay, so this is a big, audacious goal. It takes big, audacious partnerships. We've been working with a series of big fish in the advertising field, in Hollywood, reaching out to Bollywood and Nollywood and trying to get to the folks. Really, it's the writers, as we were saying. The writers are the ones coming up with the stories, so start taking them on story tours. We need, short form advertising right now is really powerful. That's what everybody's sharing. That Heineken commercial got a lot of play. Millions of views. If you guys all didn't see it, they're trying to sell beer and they're saying, have a beer, sit down with somebody who doesn't agree with you on climate change or on transgender issue or on something else, and you will find commonality. Just yesterday, I saw an advertisement from Pedigree. They sell dog food, and they took a lost dog to a Trump campaign rally. A girl is wearing a Hillary t-shirt, and she runs around saying, I can't find the person's dog owner. Can you help us? This person, and of course the crowd is like, why are you wearing a Hillary t-shirt? But they all rallied around this dog. And so then, same thing, she changed her t-shirt, she went to the other side, same reaction. The Trump supporter was trying to find the lost dog's owner. And they interviewed people afterwards and they said, yeah, we love dogs. Pedigree sold that message. Now, what would be even better is if that brand associated with us and that we influenced that, we took that power and we drove it to collective action. So a couple of ways that you could get involved. We are concretely matchmaking between the creative industry leaders and peace builders. So when there's a group in Central and Eastern Europe, they're putting out a manifesto to try and drive nonviolence and a message, we put them with some of the biggest creative teams of the biggest advertising firms to strategize with them pro bono. We just now have developed a content aggregation site. A lot of people make money off of ad tech. Why are we not making money out of our networks? Because we have a lot of people who want good content around peace building. So let's put it in one place. We'll drive traffic and eyes to that. So this is up, Unite for Peace. Check it out. If you'd like to help, put your content there, fantastic. Help us to promote the page. We do have a wonderful program with the UN Together campaign. We all know today, Unite for Peace, we're really in support of solidarity with the world's refugees and migrants. And we really want to reach out to young people who are the future creative industry and those talents and the people who are studying design and marketing and communications. And so there's a global call for student designs for a global billboard competition, and they will receive an award, a golden pencil with the One Club, and their billboards will be shown in world capitals around the world. So it's really, again, taking the positive contributions on this global scale of the future. And then finally, wow, we were moved by the music today, so thank you for sharing that. And we do have a music concert program of world musicians embedding in schools around the world to invite young musicians to tour with them, to talk about the different musicians from different parts of the world coming together to compose, perform, and record. And so Universal Spirits and Riot Artists are our partners. I have a lot more I could say about this. I wanted to give just a tiny little snippet, but really invite us to be a bit more coordinated on our messaging. I have a couple of flyers here, so come see me afterwards and I'll happily pass them out. Thank you.
Julie, that was extremely informative and I think quite exciting for all of us to learn what is already being done. And I think, as you said, to engage with the big fish, you need a network like Alliance for Peacebuilding to be the convener. And I think your inbox is going to be full of emails from around the room by the end of tonight. Thank you very much for sharing that. And it leads very well into the content of our next panelist. Mariam Faraj heads up the corporate social responsibility for MBC Group. And so from talking about the resolution and the fact it's a toddler, but we need to be promoting it more. From all the talk about narratives and from all the talk about it, how we do that, let's hear some examples from MBC Group's experience. Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you, Mark. Actually, yes, it does tie up very nicely with the past speakers, because when we talk about using brands to help social impact, in fact, this is exactly what we're doing. While MBC has been leading as a media conglomerate for the past 26 years in the region, 5 years ago, they decided to humanize the brand, taking it from on-screen to on-ground. We have been leading in entertainment, and for the past 5 years, we started leading on the corporate social responsibility in order to serve the people that actually give us the platform to be the #1 in the region, our viewers. We do have a great responsibility towards our youth, and this is exactly what we focus on. We focus on Arab youth empowerment in the region, in the Middle East. Our pillars is quite diverse. We focus on capacity building, work readiness, livelihood skills. We talked about that a lot today. We do support rising entrepreneurs and startups because we do want to create jobs, but we also want to give the chance to the youth to choose whether they want to be employees or they want to be employers. We focus a lot on humanitarian issues because, as we can see, the region nowadays needs that, and in many different ways on the ground. Child protection and education is very important for us, and this is why we're here today. In fact, we have recently started our partnership with Generations for Peace, and we are looking forward to a long-term partnership on ground. Adding to that, we do focus on the narrative and on films for social impact. We actually support young directors and producers in the region to start creating films, short films, that focus and that address social impact issues and causes within the region. Issues like early marriages, a topic that the region has been ignoring for years. Women empowerment, women economic empowerment. We talk about street children, 2 words that nobody wants to mention in the Arab world. People want to just forget about that. In fact, with the rising numbers of refugees within the Arab world, they are forced to either work at the age of 10 for 18 hours or beg on the streets. And this is something that I've seen in the region all the time, because we do have a lot of field visits to the hosting countries. I just want to give you a little bit of examples of the initiatives that we have launched in the region to mirror the strategy and our pillars. Recently, we launched an initiative called Shabab 2030, which translates into Youth 2030. And it basically focuses on raising awareness on the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have been talking about that for a number of, a few years. How can we raise awareness? How can we have basically everyone in the region understanding the 17 goals and understanding that each one of us has a role to play, trying to advocate, but also take action towards these roles. So we did what we do best, which is we launched a challenge in the region, and we asked social enterprises and social entrepreneurs, young business men and women, to apply to the challenge. We didn't mention a prize. We just said there will be a reward of some sort. Now, talking about MBC as a media conglomerate and the brand MBC Hope, MBC Al-Amal, which is the CSR arm, we received over 5,000 genuine applications over the course of 4 to 5 months. More than 50% of these applications were women, which is very impressive. What we did say is that we would like you to link your business to one or two goals of the sustainable goals. And we had a tour, a roadshow around the region where we visited 17 cities, trying to raise awareness on this challenge, trying to raise awareness on what MBC is trying to do on a social impact on ground. And we've realized we invited, we visited accelerators, incubators, entrepreneurship centers, universities, and so on, trying to talk about the challenge. But also, everywhere we visited, we invited 3 to 4 speakers from the local community to talk about their business and to talk about how they are creating jobs and also trying to give hope to the youth, but at the same time trying to give back to the community in one way or the other. Now, you'd be surprised that most of them didn't even hear of the Sustainable Development Goals, let alone know what they're all about. We do understand that there's 17, but every goal has a sub 5 to 7 other goals. So it was somehow complicated for them. But once they understood how their social enterprise is actually linking to environment, energy, education, women empowerment, gender diversity, and so on, they got very excited because they understood that they're making profit, but at the same time helping their world, helping their city, their community, and so on. So that's basically flying now, and we are actually going to be working with 10 finalists out of the 5,000 plus from different countries, representing different communities. We're going to be working with them for 1 year as a partnership. So they will lead their own initiatives and they will be MBC Hope ambassadors within their own countries, trying to raise. So it's basically youth-led. We don't tell them what to do and we don't tell them what they need. We focus on unsung heroes. We focus on stories that tell successful campaigns, non-profit campaigns. We try to focus on doing good. What does it mean to do good? As Mazen mentioned, my colleague, that there's a really bad fatigue when it comes to news. Nobody wants to hear anymore about anyone dying. In fact, I don't even watch the news anymore, and I work for NBC, so you can imagine. However, we wanted to take the news and humanize it. So we created a show 2 years back during the holy month of Ramadan. And we said, we want to partner with UNHCR on this. It's called Basmet Amal, which translates into a print of hope. We said, okay, they're all becoming numbers now, which is a very sad fact of life, but let's focus on the stories. So we got 30 stories in 30 days about resilient refugees in Jordan, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Egypt. And we paired it up with a celebrity, with an influencer. And the show rocketed. I mean, we did not believe when we learned that it was top 10 watched on screen. And what we got from that result is that the viewer is starting to go back to the human story. Yes, they want to watch Arab Idol and Got Talent and The Voice and so on, but they also want to watch the human element. They're hungry for that. They want to see the hope in the other stories. They don't want to just see people dying and children losing their parents and losing their lives. We did it again this year, and it was, again, very successful. We took Basmet Amal from on-screen to on-ground. We're starting a campaign now across the region, working with volunteers that give their time to refugees, that give their skills to refugee children. We do also, we cannot deny the fact that we can't do what we do on ground without our partners. We have many partners, UNHCR, UNDP, Save the Children, SOS. We're not there to take the job of the civil society. We're there to empower civil society to do their job. We're trying to give youth a voice, but we're also trying to link the gap or to bridge the gap between the public sector, the private sector, academia, and youth. So we're trying to give a platform to everyone to play their role. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We do have programs such as Meals for Schools with World Food Program that we started about 5 years ago in Egypt, and now it's in 5 countries, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, which basically provides economic assistance to families on the condition that they send their children to school. And most children are, 50% of them are girls, because girls in our region, I come from Egypt, and I come from a country that has over 100 million, although we don't want to admit it, but we're 100 million. And the ones that stay behind are the girls, because we don't see a value in educating girls anymore. So she either can serve at home, where she can get money, or she begs on the street, or she actually, you know, the family resorts to early marriage. So it's one less mouth to feed. We work with Save the Children on a beautiful program called Heart. And Karen, you did mention post-traumatic healing. And we do work with children that have seen things that they should not have seen at the age of 5, children that are still wetting their beds at the age of 13 and 14. And if we want to have the present and the future, I mean, I'm a mother, and I know what that is, and it breaks my heart when I see kids, their body language, they're very scared. They're extremely scared. We visit centers, youth centers in Jordan, in different parts of the region, and we see that how children are so scared to even speak because they've seen too much. So it's healing through art. We started it in Palestine for obvious reasons, and then we spread the program throughout the region. We work with UNFPA in Lebanon and Jordan. We actually founded the first youth center in Zaatari camp, which has been running now for the past 3 years, for Syrian refugees, by Syrian refugees. So in fact, we worked with civil society to train 30 young refugees to take over the center. It's theirs. It's an outlet that they can go visit, do sports, do normal things, but at the same time have capacity building training throughout the year, so one day they get out and they resume, you know, their normal life. They will be able to have skills to get a job or be an entrepreneur, but at the same time they will not hold a frustration or anger towards the other community. We work with UNFPA Lebanon on gender-based violence. We also work with youth, Lebanese and Syrian youth in Lebanon, on social cohesion, which is very important. And we did insert another program on early marriage for girls, but also for boys. And the transformation from a year, from the beginning of the program till the end, I will be wrapping up, is unbelievable. The Syrian and the Lebanese less privileged youth wouldn't even sit together in one room. They wouldn't want to mix. By the end, they were change makers, and they were the ones who were talking about the risk of early marriage and the fact that they are not neither psychologically nor physically ready for it. They started leading the discussion back to their communities, to their neighbors, to their families, their parents, their relatives, their friends. So they became advocates for these programs. We have many programs, and I do invite you to visit our website, MBC Al Amal, but it's really not enough. What I really want to say is that our slogan is, we see hope everywhere. However, we're not seeing hope anymore. We want to create hope. We want to give a chance for the young to actually have a voice and to say what they need. And that's it. Thank you.
Mariam, thank you very much. It's such a deep sense of responsibility for a corporate entity. Great link between on-ground activities and on-screen storytelling. Most of us are experts on the ground. We're not experts at converting that to on-screen. So that's where we need partners like NBC, and also great emphasis on the demand for stories that show hope. So I think we're all in the same business there. Thank you very much, Mariam. I'm very conscious of the time, and we are at risk of getting thrown out at 6 o'clock sharp. So we have 3 more speakers. We'll try and keep it short. because we also, if we don't get thrown out, we'll open it up to questions. So our next panelist with a very interesting, completely different thread on climate change, youth, peace and security is Siamak Sam Loni, the founder and global coordinator of SDSN Youth. Sami, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. So, as explained, my name is Sam Loney, and I work with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which was an entity founded by, or launched by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2012 to mobilize global expertise around the Sustainable Development Goals. And in particular, I lead the youth division of that network, SDSN Youth, which basically empowers youth globally to create sustainable solutions. And 120 team members in 20 regional and national centers, with 400 member organizations, all coming around the Sustainable Development Goals. And let me just quickly say that Resolution 2250 was a really key and groundbreaking moment in the history of the UN, and that's because for the first time it recognized young people as a key stakeholder in peace building and prevention of violent conflict. It recognized that they have a role to play and that they must be considered as partners for global peace, and this is very, very important. And especially given that a staggering 40% of the 1.4 billion people living in countries that are impacted by crises are under the age of 15, so in fragile states. And I was recently at the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, and it was very interesting to see that now, as a result of this resolution, even at the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, and Nobel laureates were actually continuously advocating for the more involvement of young people, and that was wonderful to see. So it looks like the work of the YPS has been quite successful. That resolution, and many thanks to the work of the working group with Cecile Ansari. And of course, a huge thank you to Generations for Peace for putting together this wonderful event, and all the others who are working and keeping this agenda going. And but in particular, I want to thank all the young peacekeepers around the world who are not here to tell their stories, who are not here to talk about their experiences, who are often forgotten in this world. And those stories are what matters. Those stories are what inspires people to keep going. Those stories are what keeps me inspired to keep going. And of course, to those who have given their lives to preventing violent conflicts. And I think we owe it to them to have these events and continue to have them and to keep working as hard as we can on this issue. Now, we are a proud partner on the progress study on youth, peace and security, where we were mandated to produce a thematic paper in partnership with the UNICEF report to assist the process. So, really, colleagues, friends, I really ask you to address the elephant in the room, which is climate change. So, maybe I'll just say a quick story. In early 2000s, the lack of precipitation in the atmosphere within the northeast region of the Mediterranean, in part made possible by climate change, led to a 30% decrease in rainfall. And it led to Syria suffering its worst drought in early 2000s. Sorry, in early 2006, in 1,000 years. So this drove as many young rural farmers to migrate into cities, and we know from WikiLeaks cables that the authorities at the time were talking about this thing is going to explode with the sudden migration and the lack of access to water and food, and there were a lot of things happening there. And the suffering and chaos caused by droughts were very important drivers in the initial unrest. So, and now it has claimed almost 500,000 lives. It has wounded close to 2 million people. It's generated roughly 6 million refugees and displaced almost 7 million people within Syria. Life expectancy dropped from 76 years to 55 years in just over a space of a couple of years. That is unbelievable. And it led to roughly $200 billion of damage to the economy, and now it has plunged 4 to 5 Syrians into poverty. Years of development reversed overnight. So climate change has traditionally been viewed in isolation from matters of security and human rights. However, our thematic paper shows that there is a nexus between climate change and young people's security is becoming ever more clear. and as the planet warms. It changes global climate patterns and threatens vital resources. And the rapid changes in the climate, coupled with instability, is likely to threaten the lifeline of many groups living in fragile societies, ultimately leading to additional tensions and potentially violent confrontations. And unfortunately, despite this, Resolution 2250 does not make references to climate change and does not recognize its risk to youth and peace and security. And that's unfortunate because we know that there are those impacts that really are important to consider, especially as the planet warms. And so STSN Youth decided to create a report specifically focusing on the impacts of climate change on youth, peace and security on Middle East and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and also analyze opportunities for young people of creating peace in those regions. And we chose those two regions because Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa have seen a high number of armed conflicts in recent years and are projected to face severe challenges related to climate change. And more importantly, there are regions with very young populations. For example, 60% of the population of the MENA, the Middle East and North African region, are under the age of 30. And that's important to consider. Our reports brought together 10 leading experts and academics on youth affairs, climate change, and security to investigate this relationship between climate change and youth, peace, and security. And the final report was written by Julian Payne, Anton Warrenberg, and Jal Awan. A huge thank you to them and the wonderful committee. So after months of research, we found that food insecurity, water stress, forced migration, and economic recessions are some of the main impacts associated with climate change and have truly undermined the prospects of young people for enjoying their human rights, but also doing what they in many cases are good at, which is being agents of change and creating that change that's very much necessary. So I would love to provide examples, but we don't have time for this. So I invite you to go and read the report for a lot of the case studies on how this impact is created and what it resulted in. But what's more important is that a lot of the young people on the ground understand this relationship between climate change and youth, peace, and security. So for example, when putting the report together, we also work with UNICEF U Report, and we surveyed and polled approximately 110,000 young people from around the world, particularly in fragile regions, because we wanted to hear their perspectives on it. And the numbers were staggering. Many agreed that climate change is a major security threat, especially within their countries. And they also believed in the power of education and its role in preventing conflict and also helping to overcome a lot of the challenges that come post-conflict. Friends, world governments have invested billions of dollars to accelerate development and human rights, especially in fragile regions. But policymakers risk reversing decades of progress in all areas of development if they fail to think about and mitigate security tensions, particularly those sensitive to climate variability, and in particular without the consultation and looking at the role of the young people within that. So therefore, we urge all member states to provide young people with the quality education and the tools that they need to fight the risks of climate change, to promote mechanisms that allow young people to build capacities of their communities to deal with climate change and its impacts, but also to allow the scale-up of innovations and entrepreneurship, especially for ventures working on the cross between security and sustainable development. And finally, let's build on these strategies with youth at the table, because they're disproportionately affected by these issues, and they're often key to overcoming many of those challenges. So let's bring them into the conversation. So with this in mind, we urge the UN Security Council and the new group of the champions of youth in the strongest terms to take consideration of important ecological factors like climate change when creating local strategies for youth, peace, and security. Because as we move towards a 2°C world, and the array of challenges posed by those and that world, we need to be prepared, and more importantly, we need the biggest demographic in the world on our side, which are young people. We can start by seeing them as partners in this fight. Thank you very much.
Sam, I think that was a very serious and important alarm call for all of us, but also a call to action, that each of us in our different ways at every level can be doing more to raise this on the agenda and to integrate it into our existing work. So thank you for the alarm call. Our next panelist is Daniel Hislop, Research Director for the Institute for Economics and Peace. I think you'll be very familiar with their work and the recent study on the cost effectiveness of peace building. Daniel, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'll try and keep my comments quick. A little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace. We measure peace, look at its economic benefits. The reason why we do that is because we want to understand whether or not peace is getting better and whether or not our interventions are actually helping or hindering. So a very simple premise. What do we mean by peace? Julia showed some slides before that kind of indicated how confusing some of the definitions of peace are. I'm sure if I went around the room, we'd get many, many different definitions. We use negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of violence and fear of violence. Positive peace, much more ambitious, important concept, which is the attitudes, institutions, structures which help build a peaceful society in the long run. And we've tried to measure both. And I'm going to talk very quickly on some of the trends because they are very consequential for young people. Firstly, the trend in negative peace, in violence. Well, it's been rather historic. In the last 10 years, we've seen a very big decrease in world peace, not surprising, a huge increase in the number of conflicts, a huge increase in the number of refugees, almost 1% of the global population refugees. Now, this is important for young people because by our calculations, 23% of 15 to 29-year-olds live in a state or province with armed conflict in 2016. That's hugely up. And if you look at the nature of those conflicts, they're involving many more non-state actors. So we're talking about terrorism before and violent extremism. This disproportionately affects young people. Now, in terms of the trend in positive peace, so the things that help a society maintain non-violent behaviours in the long run, well, that's also quite interesting because what we've seen there is a slight improvement in positive peace. However, the improvements have not been equal across all the dimensions that we require to build a properly peaceful world. So if we see rates of poverty going down, education going up, GDP growth going up, these are positive trends. That's fantastic. However, if we look at press freedoms, group grievances, democratic political cultures, these are actually going down. These are deteriorating. And one of our panelists before made the comment about education and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. This is the problem. It's the nexus between the mismatch of development indicators and civic and political participation, and it's that mismatch that creates the conditions for violence, and I think that's something that really does need to be drawn attention to. Now, if we look at the contextual risk environment, the risks that young people face, if we look at food prices, commodity prices, colleague here was just talking about climate change, huge changes in the last 10 years, really quite dramatic. Food price volatilities 3-4 times higher in the last 15 years than the preceding 20. Commodity prices also very vulnerable. So these are very important for fragile conflict-affected states and, again, disproportionately affects young people. If we look at the interconnectedness of societies and of the world, that's also dramatically changed in the last 10 years, much like the trend in conflict. If we look at remittance flows, that's up some 300% in the last 10 years. Remittance flows are now much bigger than official development assistance. Now, that can be a force for peace. It can also be a conflict driver in a situation. It just depends on the context. But that's a huge change in a very short period of time. Similarly, technology. Mike before made the comment about interconnectedness. If you look at 3G mobile phone coverage, that's up. It's going from about 14% of the global population covered in 2007 to about 85% in 2015. It's a huge change in a very small period of time. And what we know is that governance, rule of law, all the things that prevent violence from occurring and improves resilience, that takes a very long time to develop, whereas these risk factors are actually happening much quicker. I'll just make a final comment on some of our other work. So the Institute looks at the economic cost of violence, and we know that it's very big. It's about 12.6% of the global GDP spent on violence. it's incredibly devastating for the global economy. That's about $13.6 trillion. Now, how much do we spend on peace? Well, we spend about $6.8 billion on peace building, and we spend about $8 billion on peacekeeping. When you add up those two categories, that's less than 1% of the cost of conflict and violence. So in other words, we're spending a lot of money on violence and conflict and not very much on peace. And if we look into that peace-building expenditure, that very small amount of money, what's quite shocking, I think, is the fact that we're 16% of the official development assistance that fragile and conflict-affected states receive is related to peace-building. Donors are spending more money on roads than they are on peace building in fragile and conflict-affected states. That's a huge mismatch of resources. It works out about $6 per capita. So that's a real problem that needs to be addressed. When you look inside of that, it's uneven, it's unstable, it's stagnated, there's different priorities, and something that the Institute's been looking at is the cost effectiveness of these interventions. And what we know is because the cost of violence and conflict is so ginormous, that the interventions to prevent conflict and violence are hugely cost effective. For every dollar that's invested in peace building, there's a $16 saving in terms of mitigating conflict and violence. So I think finally, we need to remember that. I think we need to be more aware of that. There needs to be more advocacy around that. I think there's a lot of opportunity within the UN system right now around the conflict prevention agenda, around sustaining peace, around the SDGs, around SDG 16 specifically, and the new way of working, about joining up the way the UN works. Because what we also know is that you can't build sustainable peace without systematic interventions that link to each other, without coherence. And the UN is in the process of seemingly addressing that now. So I'll leave my comments there.
Daniel, thank you very much. I think that was a very important piece for us to include. I think that the data from the Institute of Economics and Peace in your most recent report, the March report, is extraordinary. It's 20 years worth of data that they've gone through. It's the most credible, most comprehensive research of its kind. I think we all have a role to play in getting that report and its key message that $1 spent on upstream conflict prevention saves $16 on the cost of conflict. That's a headline, it's a soundbite, it's manageable, it can register with people. We can all play our role in getting that message out because it will influence governments and decision makers and ultimately budgets. So thank you very much, Daniel, for raising that. Our last panelist for the third session is Saji Prelis, who's Director of Children and Youth Programs at Search for Common Ground. And we've given Saji the onerous mission of trying to wrap up the third session with all its different threads and to look ahead slightly at what he predicts might be trends coming up. Thank you very much, Saji.
Thank you, Mark. I hate being the person between getting kicked out as well as some cocktails and drinks later on. So allow me to get right to the point and speak very frankly here. It's good to go right after Danielle because there are two things I want to pull out of that. One, which I didn't hear quite clearly through the whole conversation, but except here and there, is this trust issue, right? People have lost faith and trust in institutions, whether it's the media, the governments, international NGOs. All of us have, it's our failure. And we need to recognize that we are actually very much responsible for this issue. That connects to the second one, which is that the issues are more complex, and Daniel did a fantastic job describing that. And the more complex it is, we need to ask ourselves, how are we as the institutions preparing ourselves internally to address those complex problems? Instead of focusing externally that we need peace and we need sustaining peace, what are we doing internally to actually ensure that that architecture is ready for the 21st century challenges? I think that's an important element that needs to be thought through in this system. So 6-7 years ago, when we took this path where we brought together, Cecile articulated, bringing the UN system, agencies, international NGOs, and youth organizations together to say, what do we want to do to shift the narrative of young people? And it was a very powerful case of a collective impact effort of, taking the words of partnerships, a collaborative effort with a collective impact around the Security Council Resolution 2250. pioneered primarily by young people. And now we have this, and Cecil said that really clearly, that it's in its infancy. As we start to look to the next 5 years, how are we going to be accountable in a collaborative way to the young people we serve? And for that purpose, we have this burden as the interagency working group that is co-chaired by the UN Peacebuilding Support Office, United Network of Young Peace Builders and Search for Common Ground, representing a multitude of organizations within the UN and international NGO and youth system, is how to make sure that this is collaborative, to build this field in a way that is much more accountable. Learning for the women, peace and security, the women, peace and security field, we've laid out an action plan, a framework for action that articulates a vision that we need your help in supporting. And that has 4 pillars. One is a youth-led collaboratives across the regions itself, supporting that. Second is around knowledge and data and evidence for accountability. Third is around results-based capacity strengthening, not just for youth, because I heard throughout the day that we need to empower youth. I think we need to empower ourselves to engage and understand how better to engage young people. With our institutions are old. Our crumbling infrastructure needs to be empowered in a way that enables these efforts to be addressed better. And the last, I think we've heard quite a bit, and Julia also said this, is a rebranding and a communication strategy. That needs to flow through across. Now, we can do all this individually, but if we are to really be honest with ourselves, we need to start collaborating, and I think, Mark, you really set the tone very high with the powerful words of partnerships and collaboration, and several people before me also spoke about it. We need to really authentically collaborate, right? When money is involved, we compete, which is normal. But the problems of today and tomorrow require new ways of governance, new ways of partnerships that transcend this petty money issue. Because that trust issue to their ultimate beneficiaries, ultimate partners, ultimate consumers needs to be looked at differently. So with that in mind, I think the framework of action exists. Let's read it. It's on youthforpeace.info. And let's, if we come back 5 years from now, what's the collective impact we would have had? We need to think carefully, and I hope the data, the evidence, the quality of programmings we can be proud of, so that the value for money will be much better 5 years from now than today. And thank you for letting me speak about it.
Saji, thank you very much. That was an extremely impressive summary of the issues, but also, again, the call to action for us. Let's get on board with the collaboration, the collective effort. And I think just to reflect on how that looks from a single organization, Generations for Peace, it's difficult. We are engaged in partnerships of all shapes and sizes and at different levels around the world. Every partnership requires energy, and you'd make judgments about whether that energy input required is worth the benefit in the end. I think what we need to wake up to is that unless we are engaging in partnerships and collaborations, there is no way the architecture, the structures, the institutions will be there with the capacity to take on this new paradigm we are in of huge complexity and global problems, not least climate change. And that's the challenge before us. That's the new paradigm we are all in. So we need to shift our thinking, shift the structure of our organizations, and develop that partnership competency in the same way that we would develop a muscle. It needs to be built up. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to develop it and then sustain the muscle, that competency that we're all going to need together. And I think there's such a lot of good organizations, networks, and connections being made in this room that we can use this as an opportunity to look forward. I really appreciate we're out of time. We would have loved to continue the conversation with more questions from the audience. I think my own call to action for everyone is that we keep the momentum going. The resolution has done a great job of mobilizing the world around this issue. This General Assembly has done a lot to boost that momentum, and we, in our own ways, with all our relationships at different levels, can continue that advocacy with all the data and the information we've gathered from today. We propose making this type of forum a regular thing, an annual forum, but perhaps not during General Assembly Week each time. And if we recognize one weakness of this type of forum this year, with very short notice, has been the quite chronic lack of youth voices in the room. We feel that quite deeply, and we're looking ahead to designing something even better next year. But I really am grateful for all the responses, the participation, and the interest in this forum. Thank you very much. Let's keep it going from here. Thank you. So we have some thank yous to do just before we depart.
I know everyone is ready to leave, but just quick thank you for the Permanent Mission of Jordan for sponsoring this event, officially sponsoring it. And I want to thank the panelists, Farah, Mike, Karen, Saba, Selena, Kaliana, Raul, Charles, Mazen, Cecile, Julia, Mariam, Ayamak, Daniel, and Saji. Thank you all, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a symbolic token of appreciation for all of our speakers. You may have been wondering why we have a forest up this end of the room. They are, I must admit, slightly larger than we intended when we ordered them, but they are olive trees. Now, an olive tree is, of course, a historical symbol. The olive branch is a symbol of peace. For us, it's also a symbol of Jordan. It's also, I think, a symbol, the tree of knowledge, also growth, development, sustainability. So it's our way of thanking all the speakers and panelists for your participation. It's also setting you a challenge of how you get it home. But thank you very much for all your help. Thank you. Bye-bye.